a shattered empire, torn apart by war, betrayal, and dreams of revolution. As brothers fought brothers, armies clashed, and foreign powers invaded, Russia plunged into a brutal struggle that would decide the fate of a nation and the course of history itself. This is the story of the Russian Civil War, where hope and horror collided, where loyalty and fear twisted into survival, and where the future of a world hung in the balance. Welcome to the war that wasn't just Reds versus Whites, but a battle for the soul of a people. Chapter 1. What happens when an empire starts to rot? In the winter of 1917, Russia stood on the edge of a cliff, its feet already slipping. The snow-covered streets of Petrograd whispered a bitter truth. The empire, once proud, once mighty, was dying. Not suddenly, not with an explosion, but with a slow, grinding rot that had been spreading for years, eating through the bones of power, trust, and hope. For more than 3 centuries, the Romanov dynasty had ruled over Russia like the will of God itself. The Tsar was not merely a king. He was the autocrat of all the Russias, the little father to his people, the supreme ruler chosen by divine right. But in the dying days of the empire, this image, carefully maintained through ritual, repression, and reverence, was crumbling like frost-bitten stone. The Russian Empire in the early 20th century was vast. It stretched from the icy seas of the north to the sun-baked deserts of Central Asia, from the Polish border to the Pacific. But behind the grandeur of its size lay the reality of decay. The countryside was aching. Millions of peasants worked the land with wooden tools, living in huts with dirt floors, while aristocrats in St. Petersburg dined beneath chandeliers of crystal and gold. Beneath the surface, resentment festered like an infected wound. Serfdom, abolished only in 1861, still cast a long shadow. Freedom had come late and unevenly. The landlords still ruled much of rural life. The peasants, though technically free, remained chained by debt, hunger, and hopelessness. In the cities, a different kind of discontent simmered. Industrialization had arrived, fast, furious, and unforgiving. Factories rose like blackened tombs on the skyline, pulling in workers from the countryside with promises of wages. But the reality was harsh: 12-hour shifts, brutal conditions, and pay that barely kept bread on the table. Labor strikes became more common. Voices of revolution, once whispered in corners, grew louder in taverns, workshops, and underground gatherings. And above it all, aloof, distant, and tragically out of touch, stood Tsar Nicholas II, a man born into power but never built for it. Kind-hearted, perhaps. Devoted to his family, certainly. But as a ruler, weak. Cautious. Blind to the storm growing around him. He believed in autocracy the way a priest believes in scripture, not as a choice, but as an eternal truth. Yet, the world was changing, and fast. In 1905, Russia had already felt a tremor, a warning. After a humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, discontent exploded. Protests filled the streets. On a cold January day, thousands marched peacefully to the Winter Palace to petition their Tsar. They carried icons, not weapons. They sang hymns. They believed he would listen. But the palace gates did not open. The rifles did. Imperial guards fired into the crowd, killing hundreds. That day would be remembered as Bloody Sunday. And the myth of the Tsar as the father of the people began to die. Revolution followed. A wave of strikes, mutinies, and peasant uprisings swept across the empire. Nicholas was shaken. He offered reforms, a parliament, called the Duma, and promises of change. But the concessions were half-hearted. The Duma was soon weakened, ignored, dismissed. The Tsar had given with one hand and taken with the other. By 1914, the empire was already trembling. But when the First World War broke out, it seemed to many Russians that unity had returned. Crowds filled the streets of Petrograd, cheering the Tsar. National pride surged. Russia marched to war against Germany and Austria-Hungary with songs and banners. But war, like revolution, reveals the truth beneath illusions. The Russian army was brave, but unprepared. Soldiers fought with outdated weapons, often without boots, sometimes without rifles. Entire units were sent to the front with orders to wait until a comrade fell before picking up a gun. Ammunition was scarce. Food was scarcer. The railways were a mess. Supplies rotted at stations while men starved in the trenches. And the deaths, dear God, the deaths. By 1916, over 1 million Russian soldiers had died. Millions more were wounded, missing, or captured. The wounded crowded hospitals with not enough beds, not enough doctors, not enough hope. The countryside was stripped of men, of horses, of bread. Prices soared. Inflation wrecked families. Hunger grew in the cities. And still, Nicholas clung to power. In 1915, he made a fateful decision. Against all advice, he took personal command of the Russian army. From that moment, every defeat, every disaster was now his. And while he rode trains between distant battlefields, the government in Petrograd fell into chaos. And at its heart stood one man, Grigory Rasputin, a wandering monk, a mystic, a charlatan to some, a prophet to others. He had gained the trust of the Tsarina Alexandra, who believed he could heal their hemophiliac son, Alexei. And in the Tsar's absence, Rasputin's influence grew. Ministers were hired and fired at his word. Corruption flourished. The court became a scandalous whisper behind every closed door. To the Russian people, this was unforgivable. They were dying in a war they couldn't win, starving in cities they couldn't leave, watching their children go hungry, their husbands not return, their rulers disappear into silence and superstition. The streets seethed. The front lines groaned. The empire held together, but just barely. By early 1917, something had broken. The winter was brutal. Fuel was scarce. Bread lines stretched for blocks. In Petrograd, the snow turned black with ash from burning wood and coal. Factory workers went on strike. Women, mothers, sisters, wives, marched for bread. Soldiers, exhausted and bitter, began to question their orders. The police hesitated. The army wavered. Then, crack. On March 8, 1917, International Women's Day, the protests exploded. The demonstrations that began with bread soon turned into calls for the Tsar to abdicate. Over the next week, mutinies spread. Soldiers joined the crowds. Barracks emptied into the streets. The capital became a roar of anger and hope. Nicholas, sitting in a train hundreds of miles away, received telegram after telegram. The Duma begged him to act. His generals told him the army would not stand with him. Even his allies were deserting him. On March 15, 1917, he gave in. Nicholas II, last Tsar of Russia, signed his abdication. Not with fanfare, not with dignity, but in a railway carriage, cold, tired, and beaten. 3 centuries of Romanov rule had ended with the stroke of a pen. Across Russia, there was both celebration and uncertainty. The old regime was gone, but what came next was unclear. A provisional government stepped in, promising reform, elections, a brighter future. But it was weak and slow and divided. And in the shadows, the Bolsheviks waited. But for now, in this brief, trembling moment, the empire was gone. The rot had won. The throne was empty. The streets of Petrograd were quiet, for now. But the silence would not last. For Russia was not yet done bleeding. It had only just begun. Chapter 2. Why did the Tsar just walk away? The fall of Nicholas II, last emperor of Russia, did not come with thunder or flames. It came with snow, with silence, with the slow, deliberate shattering of a centuries-old crown. It was not the spectacle of revolution we often imagine. No palace burned, no guillotine stood in the square. But in March 1917, amid the frozen streets of Petrograd, an empire that had ruled 1/6 of the world vanished in days. For 300 years, the Romanov dynasty stood as the immovable pillar of Russian life. The Tsar was more than a ruler. He was anointed, chosen, absolute. In a nation vast and divided, with peasants who barely knew the names of cities beyond their villages, the Tsar was a living icon. Nicholas II inherited this legacy, yet he carried it like a man wearing armor that didn't quite fit. He was a devoted husband, a gentle father, a man of routine and soft voice. But Russia did not need gentleness. It needed strength. It needed vision. And what it received was hesitation. Nicholas believed in divine right and tradition, beliefs that left him blind to the storm gathering just beyond the palace gates. The seeds of the Tsar's downfall were sown not in a single event, but in a slow erosion. Discontent had been rising. For decades, the scars of the 1905 revolution were still raw. That year, the empire had already come close to collapse. Protesters, unarmed, faithful, had marched to the Winter Palace to plead for justice. Instead, they were met with rifle fire. Bloody Sunday shattered the illusion that the Tsar was the people's protector. It was the first crack in the Romanov image, small, but spreading. Though Nicholas offered reforms, a national parliament, the Duma, they were half-hearted. Real power remained tightly clenched in his fists. Every reform was followed by retreat. Hopes for a constitutional monarchy were suffocated in bureaucratic delay and royal suspicion. Russia's wounds festered, and its people watched. Then came war. In 1914, the First World War erupted, and with it came a strange, brief unity. Crowds filled the streets of Petrograd, singing patriotic songs and waving flags. The Tsar, they believed, would lead them to glory. But this was no war for glory. It was a war of trenches, of mud, of machine guns and mass graves. And Russia, proud, massive, but poorly prepared, was soon drowning in disaster. Millions of men were drafted. Supplies failed. Ammunition ran dry. Soldiers were sent to the front without rifles, told to pick up the weapon of a fallen comrade. Horses outnumbered trucks. Winter clothing was scarce. Leadership was chaotic. By the end of 1916, nearly 2 million Russian soldiers were dead. Millions more wounded or missing at home. The cost was just as heavy. Food disappeared from the markets. Coal vanished. Inflation devoured wages. Women stood in line for bread that never came. And in the palaces, chandeliers still glittered. The divide between the people and the elite grew into a canyon. And still, Nicholas held on in a decision that would haunt him. The Tsar took personal command of the army in 1915. He left the capital and moved to military headquarters near the front. In doing so, he left the government in the hands of the Tsarina Alexandra, who, though devout, lacked political wisdom and the influence of a man whose name would become a symbol of everything corrupt in the dying empire, Grigory Rasputin. A mystic, a wanderer, a healer, a scandal. Rasputin claimed to soothe the bleeding illness of the royal heir, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. Alexandra, desperate to save her son, believed him. But Rasputin's power grew far beyond the sickroom. He began to influence ministerial appointments. Corruption ran wild. Newspapers hinted at debauchery. Enemies whispered of treason. The public perception was devastating. To many Russians, their empire was now ruled by a weak czar, a foreign-born empress, and a mad monk. The monarchy became not just outdated, but ridiculous. Meanwhile, the war dragged on. Defeats piled up. And in Petrograd, something began to stir. February 1917. The city was cold, exhausted, and angry. Food shortages had reached crisis levels. On February 23, International Women's Day, thousands of women took to the streets, demanding bread. They were soon joined by factory workers, students, and soldiers. Protest became strike. Strike became uprising. The crowds grew daily, tens of thousands strong. Chants changed from bread to down with the Tsar. Police clashed with protesters, but even they began to falter. Some refused to fire. Others joined the crowds. When soldiers mutinied and handed over their weapons to the people, the revolution was no longer a protest. It was a collapse. The Duma, sensing the danger, tried to take control. They formed a provisional committee. But the capital was no longer governable. Order had vanished. Nicholas, isolated at army headquarters in Mogilev, received reports, first, of protests, then of unrest, then of chaos. At first, he dismissed them. Then he tried to act. He ordered troops to restore order. But the troops refused. Generals warned him. The army would not defend the throne. The imperial train turned back, toward Petrograd. But the tracks were blocked. His route to power, physically and politically, was cut off. His generals, his ministers, his people, had turned out on March 15, 1917, under pressure from both allies and enemies, Nicholas II abdicated the throne, not in a grand hall, not with ceremony, but quietly. In the carriage of a train, stationary in the forest, he signed the abdication with a calm hand, gave up power not only for himself, but for his son. He asked that his younger brother, Grand Duke Michael, be offered the crown. But Michael refused, unless the people demanded it. They did not. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia since 1613, ended, not with a bang, but with a end in Petrograd. There was confusion, celebration, and fear. The Tsar was gone. A new government formed, the provisional government, led by liberals and moderates. They promised elections. They promised freedom. But they faced a country in chaos, war, hunger, unrest, and a growing rival in the shadows. The Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers, who answered not to the state, but to revolution. And yet, on that day, Russia was briefly united by disbelief. The empire had fallen. Nicholas returned to his family, not as ruler, but as father. He was placed under house arrest. He prayed daily. He read history books. He chopped wood. He wrote in his diary, noting the weather and family meals, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The man who once ruled millions now watched his world shrink to a few guarded rooms. Outside, Russia unraveled. The provisional government faltered. The war continued. The Bolsheviks gained power. Lenin waited. And by the end of 1917, another revolution, bolder, sharper, redder, would sweep the nation. But the fall of the Tsar, that quiet, cold abdication, was the moment the old world truly ended. It did not happen because of one man, or one mistake, or one march in the snow. It happened because the people stopped believing in the story that the empire had always told, that the Tsar was their protector, that God had chosen him, that order was eternal. When faith broke, the empire crumbled. Nicholas did not fall like a villain, nor did he rise like a hero. He simply walked away, not because he wanted to, but because the Russia he ruled no longer existed. Chapter 3. Who took power, and why did they fail so fast? When the Romanov dynasty fell in March 1917, Russia was left without a master, yet desperate for order. The imperial crown, handed down through 3 centuries of autocracy, had vanished, like a breath in winter. And in its place, a fragile hope flickered. A hope that, perhaps, a new Russia could rise, not ruled by emperors or priests, but by law, by people, by reason. Into this vacuum stepped the provisional government, a body, born not of revolution, but of emergency. It was not elected by the people. It was not forged in the streets. It was a committee of statesmen, formed hastily by the Duma, the Russian parliament that had long been weakened and ignored by the Tsar, yet had survived the storms of the past. At its head stood Prince Georgy Lvov, a nobleman known for his liberal ideals and quiet dignity. And just beneath him, a collection of former ministers, landowners, intellectuals, and moderates, men who believed that constitutional democracy could save the Russian state from collapse. For a brief moment, they were seen as saviors. But history, cruel as ever, would offer them no grace. The provisional government had barely taken its first breath before it began to stumble. Its greatest enemy was not a rival army or foreign invader. It was the unbearable weight of expectation. The people wanted peace. The soldiers wanted home. The workers wanted bread. The peasants wanted land. And the government promised everything, but delivered little. From the very beginning, it was tangled in contradiction. It declared itself temporary, merely a caretaker until a constituent assembly could be elected to shape a new Russia. Yet in calling itself provisional, it admitted weakness. It had no true mandate, no constitution, no plan that could withstand the chaos already breaking open across the empire. And most critically, it did not end the war. That, more than anything, sealed its fate. The leaders of the provisional government, Russia's commitment to World War I was a matter of honor, diplomacy, and survival. They believed that withdrawing would collapse the front, betray their allies, and invite German domination. But to the Russian people, war meant death. By 1917, The Russian army was no longer an army in spirit. It was a mass of exhausted men, starving, wounded, freezing in trenches that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Morale had evaporated. Deserters flooded the roads. Commanders were ignored. Orders disobeyed. In Petrograd, soldiers who had once marched to battle now marched in protest. When the provisional government announced it would continue the war, the reaction was explosive. Across the country, protests erupted. Soviet councils, known as Soviets, formed. In factories, in military units, in towns. These were not arms of the government. They were organs of revolution, chaotic, passionate, and growing more radical by the day. The most powerful of these was the Petrograd Soviet, which quickly became a rival center of power. And in its shadow stood a name that would soon become legend, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. But in early 1917, Lenin was still in exile. Germany, keenly aware of the chaos unfolding in its eastern enemy, saw an opportunity. In a sealed train car, they transported Lenin across Europe like a weapon smuggled. To the front, he arrived in Petrograd in April, stepping onto Russian soil with a message that electrified the revolution: peace, land, and bread. 3 words. Simple, devastating. While the provisional government spoke of constitutional reform, of patience, of committees, Lenin promised an end to war, an end to hunger, an end to the centuries of landowners stealing the sweat of peasants. His April theses were radical. He called for the overthrow of the provisional government, for power to pass entirely to the Soviets. At first, even some of his own party balked, but the people listened. Meanwhile, the provisional government continued to unravel. In May, Prince Lvov stepped down. His replacement, Alexander Kerensky, was young, charismatic, and energetic. A former lawyer, a fiery orator, a bridge between moderate socialists and liberals, Kerensky seemed the perfect man to steady the storm. And for a moment, he did. He toured the front lines. He rallied the troops. He spoke of liberty and unity. He wore a military tunic. He walked among the men. And he believed, fervently, that Russia could still win the war and become a democracy. He launched the June offensive, a last-ditch military operation against the Germans. It was a disaster. The soldiers refused to fight. Entire regiments mutinied. The front collapsed. And with it, so too did Kerensky's credibility. In July, anger boiled over into the July days. An attempted uprising by soldiers, workers, and Bolshevik sympathizers in Petrograd. The government crushed it, arresting many Bolsheviks. Lenin fled to Finland, hiding under a fake name. For a moment, it seemed the tide had turned. But that moment passed quickly. The real collapse came not with Bolshevik bullets, but with one of Kerensky's own decisions, his alliance with a man named Lavr Kornilov. Kornilov was a general, fiercely patriotic, disciplined, and appalled by the breakdown of military authority. In August 1917, Kerensky, fearing the Bolsheviks, gave Kornilov broad powers to restore order. But Kornilov misunderstood or overreached. He began moving troops toward Petrograd, believing he was saving the country from anarchy. Kerensky panicked, accused Kornilov of attempting a coup, and in desperation, he did the unthinkable. He armed the Bolsheviks, gave them weapons, gave them legitimacy, gave them, in effect, a path to power. Kornilov's troops never reached the capital. The railway. Workers stopped the trains. The soldiers refused to follow orders. The coup failed before it began. But the damage was done. Kerensky had burned the last bridges of trust. The army no longer respected him. The right saw him as weak. The left saw him as a traitor. And the Bolsheviks? They were waiting. By October, the provisional government was breathing on borrowed time. Its policies had failed to fix the food crisis. It had failed to end the war. It had failed to give land to the peasants. It had failed to inspire loyalty in the army. The Soviets, meanwhile, were growing stronger, especially in the cities. On the night of October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks made their move. Armed Red Guards seized bridges, post offices, telegraph stations. The Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, was stormed, not in a grand battle, but in a quiet, surreal seizure. The ministers were arrested. Kerensky fled. It was not a civil war. Not yet. It was a coup. A revolution within a revolution. But it marked the end of any hope that liberal democracy would rise in Russia from the ashes of autocracy. The provisional government had tried to balance too much. It had tried to be moderate in a time of extremism. It had tried to preserve a state already burning from within. And in the end, it did not fall to violence, but to irrelevance. That it was swept away by history, replaced by a new force, cold, calculating, relentless. The Bolsheviks did not inherit a functioning government. They inherited a nation in ruins. But unlike their predecessors, they were not afraid to break the old world to build a new one. And so, the experiment of moderate reform died in silence. It had lasted only 8 months. 8 months between empire and revolution. 8 months when Russia might have turned another way. But history does not move in straight lines. And in 1917, Russia turned red. Chapter 4. Why was Lenin smuggled into Russia in a sealed train? Spring, 1917. Europe trembled beneath the weight of war. For 3 years, millions had perished in the mud and fire of trenches stretching from Belgium to the Carpathians. Whole cities were shattered. Monarchies were bleeding. Empires, once thought immortal, teetered on the brink of collapse. And deep within this chaos, far from the front lines, an idea began to move. Not a bomb, not a bullet, but a man, exiled, bearded, sharp-eyed. A revolutionary who had lived for years in cafes, libraries, and safe houses across Europe. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. The world would come to know him as Lenin. In March 1917, news reached Lenin in Zurich that the Russian Tsar had abdicated. The Romanovs were gone. The centuries-old empire had vanished in the swirl of protest and mutiny. Russia stood exposed, leaderless, fragile, and unmoored. For Lenin, this moment was not merely historical. It was personal. He had dreamed of this collapse. He had written of it, argued for it, waited for it in exile, while others grew weary. But now, with the provisional government in power and revolution in the air, he faced a desperate dilemma. He needed to return. Not in months, not in weeks. Now, immediately, because revolutions, once begun, do not wait. But crossing Europe in 1917 was no simple journey. The continent was at war. Lenin was trapped in Switzerland, neutral and isolated, while Germany, Russia's enemy, stood directly between him and Petrograd. France and Britain, Russia's allies, would never allow a known revolutionary to pass through their territory. And the Russians? The provisional government viewed him as a dangerous agitator, but then, an opportunity. One as audacious as it was improbable. Germany, locked in a bitter struggle with Russia on the Eastern Front, saw a chance to strike a different kind of blow. Their generals and diplomats understood that ideas could be as deadly as artillery. And Lenin, with his calls for peace and revolution, could become a weapon aimed straight at the heart of Russia. And so, in the shadowy world of wartime intrigue, a plan was born. The German High Command agreed to transport Lenin and his entourage across Germany in a sealed train. The logic was simple. If Lenin could help destabilize Russia further, if he could pull it out of the war, Germany could shift its armies west. It was a gamble. It was a risk, but it was one they were willing to take. Lenin accepted. This decision was seen as betrayal, a revolutionary making a deal with an imperial enemy. But to Lenin, it was necessity. History, he believed, offered only rare moments of transformation, and this was one. The arrangements were strange, almost theatrical. The train was sealed, literally. Lenin and his companions would travel in a designated carriage, barred from contact with the German population. It was treated, legally, as extraterritorial, a strange limbo between borders. They brought food, books, a typewriter. They argued, they planned, they watched the countryside slide past in silence. And as the train moved eastward, so too did history. From Zurich, they traveled to the German port of Sassnitz. From there, they crossed the Baltic Sea on a Swedish ferry, then continued by rail through Stockholm and Helsinki. The journey took weeks. Each station, each border, a potential flashpoint. Yet somehow, it succeeded that on the night of April 3rd, 1917, Lenin arrived at Finland Station in Petrograd. He was met by a crowd, Bolsheviks, workers, soldiers, curious onlookers. A military band played. Red flags waved. But this was not a hero's welcome. It was uncertain, charged with tension. Many were unsure what to make of him. The provisional government saw him as a threat. Some Soviets feared he would split the revolution. But when Lenin stepped onto the platform, his coat dusty, his eyes alive, he did not offer comfort. He offered fire. He climbed onto an armored car and delivered a speech that shocked even his supporters. He declared the provisional government illegitimate. He called for all power to the Soviets. He demanded an end to the war, an end to the capitalist order, an end to compromise. To many, he sounded mad, too extreme, too impatient. But to others, especially the factory workers, the soldiers tired of blood, the peasants still waiting for land, he spoke the truth. Lenin returned to a Russia already in turmoil. The provisional government was floundering. The Soviets were rising. But no one, no faction, had yet seized complete control. The future remained unwritten. And in this fragile window, Lenin went to work that he was not content to wait. From the moment he returned, he poured energy into the Bolshevik cause, writing, organizing, speaking. He published his April Theses, a radical blueprint for revolution. Many within the Bolshevik party were stunned. They had hoped for cooperation, for gradual change. But Lenin would not bend. He knew what he wanted: peace, land, bread, and power, real power, not shared or borrowed, but seized. Lenin's return redefined the revolution. Until then, many saw the fall of the Tsar as an end. Lenin saw it as a beginning. The monarchy was gone, but the system, the inequality, the war, they remained. For Lenin, there could be no halfway revolution. He began building alliances with the Workers' Soviets. He challenged other socialist parties, denouncing them as compromisers. He pushed the Bolsheviks from fringe to force. He refused to join the provisional government, even when offered influence. Instead, he set his eyes on its destruction. Throughout the summer of 1917, Lenin's influence grew, but so did resistance. In July, an attempted uprising in Petrograd was crushed. Lenin was forced into hiding, disguised in wig and fake papers, fleeing north to Finland. The government accused him of being a German spy, an accusation that, while partially true in funding and transport, ignored the larger truth. Lenin served no nation. He served an idea. From his hideout, he wrote. He plotted. He waited. Meanwhile, the failures of the provisional government multiplied. The war dragged on. The army disintegrated. Food shortages worsened. Land seizures spread across the countryside. Faith in Kerensky evaporated. By the time Lenin returned from hiding in October, the moment had come. The people were disillusioned. The Soviets were restless. The Bolsheviks were armed. But none of it would have been possible. None of it. If Lenin had not made it back to Russia. And he made it back because Germany had gambled in the great chessboard of World War I. The German high command had moved. A single piece, a train, with one man inside. They believed they were unleashing chaos upon their enemy. And they were right. But what they did not foresee, what no one could foresee, was that Lenin would not merely disrupt Russia, that he would remake it, from exile, from a sealed carriage, from the margins of European politics. Lenin returned not as a passenger, but as a spark, and in the months to come, that spark would ignite a fire that would burn across the vastness of Russia. The war, the revolution, the Tsars, the liberals, the generals, all of them would fall beneath its heat, because, in 1917, the fate of a nation rode inside a sealed train, and when the doors opened, the world changed forever. Chapter 5. How did the Bolsheviks take over without a fight? October 1917. The air in Petrograd hung heavy with tension, yet, strangely, quiet. There were no great parades, no thunderous crowds, no blood running through the streets. Not yet. Instead, the revolution came like a whisper, a soft rustle in the dead of night. Footsteps, locked doors, orders given in shadows, and in that silence, power changed hands. The Bolsheviks, the once marginal, often mocked revolutionary faction, did not storm their way into control. They did not unleash an army of millions. They did not burn the city to ash. They simply stepped in, and the old order, fragile as dried leaves, crumbled in their hands. The world had expected revolution to roar. But this one began with eerie calm. To understand how this happened, we must go back, not just to October, but to the long, unbroken collapse that had begun months earlier. The provisional government, now led by Alexander Kerensky, was barely holding on. Since July, it had suffered defeat after defeat, not in battle, but in the hearts of the people. The war continued. Hunger spread. Factories stood idle. Soldiers abandoned the front. Peasants seized land. Every promise made had become a wound, reopened daily. The government's authority had bled away, and in its place rose another power, fierce, disciplined, and patient, the Soviets. And within them, the Bolsheviks. By autumn, the Bolsheviks had quietly, methodically taken control of the Petrograd Soviet, one of the most powerful political bodies in the capital. They now commanded the loyalty of workers' committees, military garrisons, and Red Guard detachments. But they did not yet control the country. And they knew this moment would not last. If they did not act, someone else would. Lenin returned from hiding in Finland. Since the time had come, he did not want debate. He wanted action. Power, he believed, would not be won in speeches, but seized in silence. In the first days of October, he began urging the Bolshevik leadership to prepare for an armed uprising. Not next week. Not next month. Now, many hesitated. Even within the party, there were doubts. Leon Trotsky, now chairman of the Petrograd Soviet and commander of the city's garrison, counseled strategy, caution, timing. Others feared civil war, feared a bloodbath. But Lenin's voice cut through them all. Sharp, impatient, unrelenting, he argued that the conditions were perfect. The people were with them. The army was with them. The state was paralyzed. And more than that, every delay risked betrayal. And so, the plan took shape. Trotsky would lead. He created the Military Revolutionary Committee, a Soviet body, technically legal, that would coordinate the uprising under the guise of protecting Petrograd. Under its cover, Red Guards and sympathetic soldiers began moving. They took over bridges, rail stations, telegraph offices, print shops, all quietly, efficiently, like clockwork. The government watched with unease, but confusion. Kerensky, overwhelmed and isolated, could not tell whether these movements were legitimate or mutinous. He had few loyal troops left, fewer allies, even fewer options. That on the morning of October 25, 1917, Petrograd woke up unchanged. There was no great explosion, no panic. Streetcars still moved. Workers still walked to factories. Shops opened. Children played. But behind that normalcy, the Bolsheviks were in motion. That day, Red Guards surrounded the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. Inside, Kerensky was gone, fled in a borrowed car, hoping to rally troops elsewhere. A handful of ministers remained, guarded by cadets and a few loyal officers. The palace was massive, cold, dimly lit, symbol of the Tsarist age, now occupied by the remnants of a doomed democracy. Outside, the Bolsheviks waited. Hours passed, and then, after midnight, a shot rang out from the Aurora, a warship anchored in the Neva River. Not a shell, but a signal. The final act had begun. Red Guards stormed the palace. There was some resistance, brief, confused. A few shots fired in the dark. But there was no great battle, no massacre, and by morning, it was done. The provisional government had been arrested. Power, real, total, unquestionable power, now belonged to the Bolsheviks, and it had happened with barely a cry. But why? Why had a government fallen so quietly, so completely? Because it was already dead. It had lost the army, lost the cities, lost the trust of a starving, war-weary nation. And when the Bolsheviks moved, decisively, ruthlessly, it was not a clash. It was a vacuum, being filled. In the Smolny Institute, a former girls' school turned Bolshevik headquarters, Lenin appeared that evening. His eyes gleamed behind steel-rimmed glasses. He climbed the podium of the Second Congress of Soviets and declared, We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order. Applause erupted, not universal, but thunderous among his supporters. Some delegates walked out in protest. Others stayed. And in that hall, in those quiet hours of a Petrograd night, the world turned. The Congress voted to transfer all power to the Soviets. A new government was formed, the Council of People's Commissars, led by Lenin. Trotsky took charge of foreign affairs. Stalin, of nationalities. There was no election, no referendum, but there was order. Swift, brutal, complete. Still, beyond the capital, Russia stirred uneasily. Not all welcomed the new regime. Not all would obey. And while the Bolsheviks controlled the heart, the limbs of the empire writhed in defiance. Civil war loomed. But in this chapter, the battlefield remained silent. The October Revolution, so often remembered in murals and myths as a storm, was, in truth, a quiet coup that succeeded not because of overwhelming force, but because of clarity. Ruthless clarity. The Bolsheviks knew exactly what they wanted, and they were willing to do anything to get it. They had discipline. They had timing. And above all, they had Lenin. When others debated, he acted. When others hesitated, he commanded. When others dreamed, he struck. And so, the Bolsheviks took power, without a grand battle, without a glorious charge, without a crowd to cheer them on. They simply walked through the open door of a broken system and shut it behind them. The age of emperors had ended. The age of parliaments had failed. And the age of the Soviet had begun. It would not be gentle. It would not be peaceful. But on that night in October, history was quiet, too quiet, because revolutions that arrive without a fight often bring the fiercest wars still to come. Chapter 6. Did Russia trade one war for another? Winter crept into Russia like a phantom, cold, unforgiving, and strangely still. Snow blanketed the vast, broken empire, muting the echoes of revolution. Petrograd, once a city of parades and slogans, had gone quiet. The guns had not yet returned, but they would, and when they did, they would not speak for foreign kings or distant empires, but for Russia herself, against herself. Yet in the fragile weeks following the October Revolution, the greatest question on every trembling lip was not about class, or land, or power. It was about war. Would it end? For nearly 4 years, Russia had bled on the killing fields of the First World War. Millions were dead. Millions more were maimed, missing, or broken in ways that could never be mended. Towns had emptied. Families had been shattered. And faith in monarchs, in governments, in promises, had been lost in the mud of Galicia and the icy trenches of the Baltic. The people wanted peace. They needed peace, and Lenin had promised it. When he stood before the Soviets after the Bolsheviks seized power, he offered 3 words that struck like lightning: peace, land, bread. Now the time had come to deliver the first. But peace would not come easily, nor cheaply. The German army still loomed along the front. Thousands of miles of frozen trenches, barbed wire, and shell holes stretched across Eastern Europe. And though Germany was weary of war, they had the upper hand. Russia was collapsing, politically and militarily. The Bolsheviks had no organized state, no command structure, and no international recognition. But they had one thing left: desperation. Lenin, above all, believed the Bolsheviks' survival depended on ending the war. Immediately, not in weeks, not in negotiations. Now, war, he said, was a poison. One more campaign could destroy the revolution. If they did not make peace, they would be swept away like the Tsar before them. So, in December 1917, the new Soviet government sent envoys to Brest-Litovsk, a small Polish town now under German occupation. There, beneath a faded imperial banner, the most surreal of meetings began. On one side, seasoned generals, German princes, cold-eyed strategists. On the other, young revolutionaries in mismatched coats, still learning to represent a state that had only existed for weeks. They did not shake hands. They barely understood each other, politically or literally. Yet Trotsky, fiery and eloquent, led the Soviet delegation. He had little experience as a diplomat, but he carried the fire of revolution in his voice. He spoke not just for Russia, but for the imagined uprisings of the world that he delayed. He postured. He hoped, perhaps foolishly, that revolution would break out in Germany, that workers there, inspired by the Russian example, would rise and refuse to fight. But Germany had no time for dreams. They wanted land. Concessions, guarantees. Trotsky refused in early 1918. He tried to end negotiations on his own terms, with a strange formula: no war, no peace. He declared Russia would demobilize, but sign no treaty. It was a gamble, a performance, but the Germans responded with steel. They launched Operation Feuchtschlag, a sudden, brutal offensive across the Eastern Front. With hardly any resistance, they advanced hundreds of miles in days. They took cities, towns, and railways. They marched almost as far as Petrograd itself. It was not war. It was a walkover. The Soviet state, barely born, stood naked before the enemy. And Lenin blinked. He overruled Trotsky. He told the party, sign the treaty, no matter the cost. His words were simple: you must sign this shameful peace in order to save the world revolution. And so, on March 3, 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed. It was one of the harshest treaties in modern history. Russia lost control of Poland, Ukraine, Finland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These were not scraps of land. They were breadbaskets, coal fields, and vital rail links. Russia lost over 1 million square kilometers, territory that held a third of her population and much of her industry. The revolution had traded land for time. For Lenin, it was a necessary evil. But for many Bolsheviks, it was betrayal. A betrayal of socialism. A betrayal of sovereignty. A betrayal of hope. Some even called for Lenin's removal. They could not believe that the man who had promised peace was willing to carve up the motherland like a dead animal. But Lenin held the line, because to him, survival mattered more than honor. A revolution dead on the battlefield would not make history. It would become a footnote. Yet the ink on the treaty had barely dried before new enemies began to stir, because while Germany marched off with land, inside Russia, chaos returned. The surrender had not brought calm. It had fractured the country further. The old generals, the ones who had once served the Tsar, were enraged. Monarchists, conservatives, moderate socialists, and even some liberals saw the treaty as proof of Bolshevik treason. They began to rally forces, not under one banner, but many. The white movement was born in the south, in Siberia, in the north. They formed armies, issued proclamations, reached out to foreign powers. Britain, France, the United States, all, shocked by Russia's separate peace, began to pour weapons, gold, and advisors into these anti-Bolshevik fronts. Even Japan landed troops on Russian soil, and now, the Bolsheviks, who had ended one war, faced another. A civil war. A war far more complex, more brutal, more personal, because this was not a fight of flags and frontiers. This was a war of villages, of families, of neighbors turned against neighbors, and all of it triggered by that silent signature in Brest-Litovsk. Lenin had hoped to end the bleeding. He had believed, perhaps naively, that the workers of Europe would rise in solidarity, that the Soviet state would have breathing room to build a new world. But what he got was siege. Siege from within. By mid-1918, assassination attempts rocked the Bolshevik leadership. Lenin himself was shot, twice, by a socialist revolutionary woman named Fanny Kaplan. He survived, but barely. In retaliation, the Bolsheviks unleashed the Red Terror, a brutal crackdown on opponents, real or imagined. Prisons filled. Executions became routine. There would be no second compromise, no second treaty. The Bolsheviks would not trade peace again. The irony was cruel. They had escaped one war by signing away half the empire, only to be dragged into another war that threatened to destroy what remained. But this time, the enemy was not foreign. It was Russian. In cities, in forests, in frozen fields, the blood of a new war began to flow, and it would stain the soil far deeper than any treaty ever could. Yes, Russia had ended one war, but in doing so, she had invited another. A war not of empires, but of souls. Chapter 7. Why were the Romanovs executed in the dead of night? The house stood still under the pale July moon, quiet, almost unremarkable. Its whitewashed walls concealed more than just rooms. Inside, history waited to end for months. The Romanovs had lived in a strange half-life. Prisoners, yet not formally condemned. Dethroned, yet still symbols. From palace halls to guarded bedrooms, their world had shrunk into shadows. What began with abdication had now become isolation. It was the early summer of 1918. Russia, bleeding and broken, was splitting apart. Civil war raged across her soil. Red battled white. Foreign troops landed on her shores. Chaos threatened to consume what little order remained. And in the center of it all, held inside a modest house in Ekaterinburg, sat the last Tsar, Nicholas II, once little father of a vast empire. Now paced inside his confined quarters, a shadow of the man he used to be. His face was pale, his beard trimmed short, his uniform gone. He was no longer emperor, no longer autocrat, just citizen Romanov. With him were his wife, Alexandra, once the powerful and proud Tsarina. Their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and young Alexei, shared the same tight quarters, the same fading hope. The girls had tried to smile through it, all keeping diaries, comforting one another. Alexei, fragile and suffering from hemophilia, was often too weak to leave bed. Their days were monotonous: cold meals, washed walks, whispered prayers. And above them, the guards grew harsher. Something had changed. The Bolsheviks, once unsure what to do with the royal family, had grown restless. Lenin never spoke of them directly in public, but privately, he knew their presence was dangerous. They were more than prisoners. They were icons that the whites, the anti-Bolshevik forces surging in from Siberia and the south. The Romanovs were a rallying cry. If rescued, they could be restored. If restored, the revolution might fall. And so, a decision took shape, not in courtrooms or parliaments, but in the silence of a revolution at war. On the night of July 16, 1918, a car arrived outside the Ipatov house, its engine idled for hours. No one inside moved. Just after midnight, orders came down. The Romanovs were told to dress quickly. A rumor was whispered that they were to be relocated. The whites were nearing the city, and for safety, they had to be moved. They believed it. Nicholas helped Alexei into his arms. Alexandra wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The daughters carried small bags. Inside, jewels were sewn into their corsets and dresses, stitched into seams. Perhaps they thought they would return one day. They were led to the basement. A narrow room, bare, damp. One chair. Nicholas sat, holding his son. The others stood nearby. And then, they waited. Minutes passed. Then footsteps. The guards entered. 10 of them. Some visibly drunk. Some shaking. All armed. A piece of paper was read aloud. Hurried, stammering. It accused Nicholas of crimes against the Russian people. Declared the family guilty. Nicholas looked confused. What? He asked. Then a pistol fired. And in an instant, the room erupted into screams, gunfire, smoke. The Tsar fell first. Shot. Point blank in the chest. Alexandra gasped, but said nothing. She was killed next. The daughters, confused and horrified, tried to shield each other. But the bullets, at first, did not kill them. The jewels sewn into their clothing had acted as armor. Bullets ricocheted. The guards panicked. Bayonets were drawn. More gunshots. More shouting. When it was over, the basement was silent again. But soaked in blood. 11 bodies lay on the floor. The Tsar, the Tsarina, their 5 children, and 4 loyal servants. The execution had lasted less than 20 minutes, but its impact would echo for a century. Outside, the city slept, unaware. No announcements were made. No photographs released. The bodies were dumped in a forest, burned with acid, buried in haste. Even their graves were hidden. Why the secrecy? Because it wasn't just a killing. It was a message. The Bolsheviks didn't just want the Romanovs gone. They wanted them erased, stripped of martyrdom, denied ceremony. They feared the myth more than the man. Nicholas had already fallen. But dead, he could become a symbol, a saint. a banner for the whites. Lenin would not allow that. So the murders were covered up. Only later, as the tide of war shifted, did word spread. The whites discovered the blood-stained room. Bullet holes, shell casings, walls scrubbed, but not clean. Photographs were taken. Eyewitnesses interviewed. But by then, it was too late. The family was gone. Years would pass before the truth emerged. In full, the bones unearthed in the 1990s. The DNA confirmed. The Orthodox Church canonized them as martyrs. But in that moment, back in 1918, the message was clear. The old world was not just dying. It had been executed, shot in the dark, buried in silence. And from that silence, the new Russia rose, cold, ruthless, determined. The monarchy had been swept aside not with revolution, but with gunfire. And for the first time in centuries, Russia belonged not to tsars, but to ideas that to men who believed that history must be remade by any means, even if that meant killing a family in the dead of night. Chapter 8. Who were the whites, and could they have won? When the echo of gunfire fell silent in Ekaterinburg, a new force began to rise in the fractured landscape of Russia. A force united by hatred of Bolshevik rule, by memory of old loyalties, and by dreams of restoring order. They called themselves the Whites. And for a brief, tumultuous time, many wondered, could they win? The Whites were not an army in any unified sense. They were a mosaic of generals, monarchists, liberals, nationalists, and foreign backers. Their motives varied widely, but their shared goal was clear: to overthrow the Bolsheviks and either restore the old regime or build a new one based on national unity and traditional values that in the vast stretches of Siberia. General Alexander Kolchak raised his banner. A former naval officer, he declared himself supreme ruler of Russia. His gold-embroidered coat glinted with ambition and old-world pride. Thousands rallied to his cause: officers, students, peasants who loathed Bolshevik requisition squads, Cossacks defending their land, Orthodox priests praying over makeshift altars. But Kolchak's army suffered from the same weaknesses that plagued all white forces: vast distances, tenuous supply lines, poor coordination, and an uncertain vision for Russia's future. He controlled railways stretching from Omsk to the Urals, but lacked food, ammunition, and cohesion. His Siberian volunteers fought passionately, but they did not know whether they fought for a constitutional monarchy, for landowners' rights, or simply for the defeat of the Reds. That on the southern front, another white leader emerged: General Anton Denikin, once a decorated Tsarist commander. He marched north from the Caucasus with thousands of Don and Kuban Cossacks at his back. His troops advanced across the steppe, taking Rostov, capturing railway hubs, pushing inexorably toward Moscow. But like Kolchak, Denikin dreamed of a restored Russia without an agreed plan for political structure. Meanwhile, in Crimea, General Pyotr Wrangle carried on Denikin's legacy. A dashing, urbane officer, he insisted on discipline, propaganda, even land reform. But he, too, lacked strength and depth in the far north. Another white army took shape under the command of General Yevgeny Miller, men who saw their destiny in Petrograd. Yet despite these disparate fronts, the whites remained disjointed. They did not speak with one voice. They did not fight under a unified command. They did not share a coherent manifesto. Their armies fought in isolation, sometimes even with conflicting interests. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks, centered in Moscow and Petrograd, had begun transforming into a political machine. They molded the Red Army under Leon Trotsky's iron will. They organized commissars to enforce discipline, ensured propaganda was relentless, and framed the conflict as not just a war for Russia, but for the world, the workers, and the future. Between Reds and Whites lay the fluid ground of the countryside, where local warlords, bandits, anarchists, and peasant militias flourished, and where victory would often be decided. The Whites were hamstrung by their own history. They carried the baggage of the old order, the Tsarist regime, corruption, land inequality, and allegiance to foreign powers. The peasants, who comprised 80% of Russia's population, remained suspicious. They feared landowners more than Bolsheviks and remembered centuries of serfdom. Many deserted to the Reds' promise of land redistribution. Foreign powers, Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, supplied the whites with money, weapons, even boots. But this foreign support became a liability. Bolsheviks called it imperialist intervention. They used images of British Tommy guns and Japanese helmets to stoke nationalist hatred. They argued that the whites wanted to reinstate the old elites on behalf of foreign masters. This argument resonated as Denikin advanced in 1919 toward Moscow. He paused on the outskirts, waiting for unified command, waiting for more supplies, waiting for political agreement. Kolchak suffered from typhus, starvation, and rail sabotage. Miller lacked rail cars. Wrangle tried land reforms in 1920, but only as a desperate gamble, when time had already run out. The turning point came in late 1919. The Red Army, disciplined, centralized under Trotsky, and motivated by an apocalyptic sense of ideological struggle, began a fierce counteroffensive. They retook Kazan, Samara, and strategic railway lines. They pushed Denikin south, scattering his armies in the North Caucasus. They encircled Kolchak in Siberia, capturing him near Irkutsk in January 1920. The whites collapsed, fragmented, starved, leaderless. Their soldiers laid down guns or melted into partisan bands. Their leaders fled by ship or train, some to Turkey, some to France, some to oblivion. Could they have won? Some historians argue that they might, had they united. Had Denikin coordinated with Kolchak. Had Wrangle acted earlier. Had the foreign support been matched to strategic goals rather than political bargaining. Had they converted from generals into statesmen by promising land reform, by articulating a clear vision, or at least sharing an ideology strong enough to bind them together. Had the peasants believed them rather than the Reds. Had the Cossacks remained loyal to the cause rather than their own homelands. Had the West taken a unified stand. But these were possibilities, not realities. In the end, the whites were undone not just by the enemies they shot at, but by the elements they chose to ignore. They were undone by politics by disunity by their refusal to shake off the past. They were undone by their inability to walk into the hearts of the Russian people whose loyalty they needed. They stumbled upon history, while the Bolsheviks seized it. Could they have won? Perhaps, but they never spoke as one. They never fought for a future, only against the present. And in a conflict about what Russia should become, being against something was not enough. It was far easier to shout down with the Reds than to explain what comes next. And so, the whites fell, not with a storm of steel, but with the slow crumble of all they once represented. The dream of a Russia restored died, as all dreams do, when they meet the hard soil of change, and on the ruins of empire, a new, brutal order would rise. Chapter 9. How did a man on a train build the Red Army? In the autumn of 1917, as revolution swept Petrograd like a whirlwind, a man traveled into history aboard a train. Not an ordinary train, with whistles and steel, but a carriage transformed into a crucible of ideas, ambition, and sudden purpose. His name was Leon Trotsky, a revolutionary, an orator, a strategist. And inside that train, he glimpsed a future he would build, not with words alone, but with iron and discipline. Trotsky arrived in Petrograd from exile as the revolution surged around him. He was different from Lenin, charismatic, dynamic, conversational, and yet he shared the same hunger for absolute transformation. With Lenin, he believed that the path to power lay not just through councils or slogans, but through military might, organization, and unflinching will. In the winter of 1917 to 1918, Bolsheviks found themselves in power, but surrounded by enemies. The white forces were gathering in the south and east. The ghost of foreign invasion loomed. Internal dissent whispered in dark corners. The revolution stood on thin ice, victorious, yet vulnerable, and Trotsky saw the danger. He understood that power without an army was nothing more than a mirage. The Bolsheviks had won Petrograd streets, but they had no state. They had no national mandate. They had barely formed a government. Trotsky's answer was a gamble. He proposed transforming the chaotic militias, the Red Guards, and revolutionary detachments into a centralized, disciplined, ideological army, the Red Army. All power to the Soviets had meant nothing if nobody could defend them. From January 1918 onward, Trotsky acted. He insisted on conscription. He insisted on training. He insisted on hierarchy. He insisted that commissars be attached to units, not as observers, but as political overseers tasked with enforcing loyalty and ideology. Party loyalty was weaponized. Discipline became doctrine. That first winter, Trotsky traveled across war-torn cities in his armored train. It was his mobile command center, windows braced with steel, a generator humming beneath the floor, telegraph lines running along the tracks. He moved from the Crimea to Moscow, to the Volga, to Siberia, always at the center of unfolding plans.in. Each station, he spoke to soldiers. He delivered fiery speeches. He met with commanders. He argued, cajoled, ordered. He brought discipline to chaos. But it was not only speeches and trains. It was harsh, pitiless action. Desertion was met with execution. At least 1 in every 10 deserters is said to have been shot at random, not necessarily officers, often ordinary soldiers. And the commissars were free to dispense immediate punishment by firing squads, by deprivations, by fear. Trotsky's logic was ruthless. Without discipline, the Red Army would collapse like a sandcastle. Yet he also made concessions to Russian tradition. He allowed elected officers, but with final approval. He allowed prisoners of war to join, in exchange for loyalty oaths. His armies fought not under Tsarist banners, but red flags and slogans. May 1918. With the Whites advancing and Germany breathing down the fledgling Soviet state, Trotsky began deploying these organized Red Army units beyond Petrograd. He sent armies south to confront Denikin's forces, east to stop Kolchak, north to defend Murmansk, all under centralized command, and delivered with brutal efficiency. This efficiency allowed him to hold strategic cities and logistics hubs. He seized the railway junctions of Tsaritsyn and Samara. He retook Kazan. He crushed opposition before it could consolidate. By late 1918, the Red Army had swelled to over 1 million men. By 1920, over 5 million. Compare that to a fragmented white force numbering perhaps 1 million, but scattered, poorly led, and ideologically fractured. Trotsky's victories were decisive. He crushed Yudenika's march on Petrograd in 1919. He funneled reinforcements to Wrangle's fronts in Crimea. He coordinated arms and fitting support across vast distances, often in sub-zero rail convoys, under Bolshevik control. But there were costs: massacres of civilians in suspected rebel towns, kidnappings of families of officers, reprisals, communist rule enforced through terror. Trotsky knew all this. He saw the logic. Wars rarely welcome nuance. Once arms were taken up, mercy became luxury. Enemy officers made enemies. Hostile populations bred resentment, and revenge bred terror that was harder to stop than violence itself. Yet through all this, Trotsky remained convinced that his brutal measures were temporary, necessary, that the revolution would survive only through sacrifice. He would later warn that you may not believe in injustice, but justice will still be done. In 1921, Trotsky would fall from favor. He would be sidelined by Stalin. Assassins would stalk him. He would be exiled and eventually assassinated. But in 1918 and 1919, aboard that train and in every trench, he was the heartbeat of the Red Army. He had built it from nothing, not out of nostalgia, but out of ruthlessness, order, and ideology. And it would win. By 1920, the Red Army had triumphed over the Whites. Trotsky's armies had liberated Crimea, Siberia, Ukraine, the Caucasus. They had reclaimed the nation, land by land, rail by rail, forward. Again and again, upon its hard-won victory, however, Russia was fatigued. Soldiers returned home to a country laid barren by war, famine, disease. The Red Army's brutality, its terror, had left scars deeper than gunfire. Lenin, speaking of the 60,000 captured prisoners, lamented that, in war, as in everything, one man is one man. Trotsky had created a military colossus out of revolution's chaos. But he had also transformed Russia into a state where armed violence was a tool of governance. The story of the Red Army, the brutality, the discipline, the ideological fervor is inseparable from Trotsky's vision. A man on a train forged an army from revolutionary resolve and wartime necessity. They marched into history, carrying a red flag, discipline, and dread. And as the last echoes of civil war faded, the world would never again be the same. Chapter 10. Why did everyone start fighting everyone? The Russian Civil War, often described in stark terms of reds versus whites, was, in truth, far more complicated, a tangled web of factions, loyalties, and betrayals. As the Bolsheviks and the White Armies clashed across the vast Russian landscape, an even more chaotic and fragmented struggle unfolded beneath and alongside their conflict, a war within the war. It was here that the Greens rose, a patchwork of peasant militias, anarchists, and local self-defense groups, driven not by ideology alone, but by desperation, fear, and a fierce desire to protect their homes from all invaders. These were men and women caught in the brutal crossfire of revolution and counter-revolution, whose motivations were as diverse as the villages and forests they defended. To understand why everyone started fighting everyone else, we must look beyond the headlines of Bolshevik triumphs and white defeats. We must peer into the fractured reality of Russia's countryside, where the central authority was often little more than a distant rumor, and where survival demanded taking up arms against any force that threatened one's land, family, or way of life. The Greens, as the historiography would later call them, were not a unified force. They were loosely affiliated bands of peasants, often armed with whatever tools and weapons they could find: axes, hunting rifles, even pitchforks. Their rebellion was less a calculated political movement and more a spontaneous, primal resistance to the chaos enveloping the land. For these peasants, both the Red and White armies represented danger. The Whites, often led by former Tsarist officers, were seen as a return to the old oppressive order, aristocrats and landowners who sought to re-establish control over serfs and poor peasants. The Reds, on the other hand, brought conscription, grain requisitions, and brutal discipline. The Bolshevik policy of war communism, introduced in 1918, demanded that peasants surrender grain and produce to the state to feed the cities and armies. This policy bred resentment and desperation. Peasants resisted by hoarding grain or burning crops. When the Bolsheviks responded with violent requisition squads, it only deepened hostility. In many regions, this hostility boiled over into outright rebellion. The Tambov Rebellion of 1920 to 1921 is perhaps the most infamous example, a massive uprising led by peasants under Alexander Antonov, who demanded an end to grain seizures and the right to manage their own affairs. For 2 years, tens of thousands fought against the Red Army's brutal suppression, guerrilla tactics, and punitive expeditions. But the Greens were not merely peasants rebelling against Bolsheviks. In some areas, they clashed violently with the Whites, who in turn executed suspected sympathizers and destroyed villages. The chaos fed on itself, cycles of retaliation and massacre tearing through the countryside. Meanwhile, the anarchists, inspired by the writings of Peter Kropotkin and Mikhail Bakunin, saw both Reds and Whites as tyrants to be overthrown. In Ukraine, for example, the Black Army, led by Nestor Makhno, carved out a territory based on anarchist principles: workers' councils, self-managed communes, and free militias. Makhno's forces fought a shifting war, sometimes allying with the Bolsheviks against the Whites, sometimes clashing fiercely with the Reds when ideological differences erupted into violence. His troops, known for their lightning raids and deep knowledge of the local terrain, became both revered and feared. This multipolar conflict created a bewildering landscape of alliances and betrayals. Villages could change hands multiple times. Armies fought battles not only over cities, but over farms, railways, and forests. Loyalties shifted with survival, ideology, and opportunity. Amid this turmoil, foreign powers played their own parts. Allied interventionists, British, French, American, Japanese, landed troops on Russian soil, supporting various anti-Bolshevik factions, further complicating the chaos. These forces sought to curb Bolshevik power but often lacked a coherent strategy, further fueling local resentments and prolonging the violence. The war within the war was marked by ferocity rarely seen in conventional conflicts. Peasants, revolutionaries, soldiers, and mercenaries waged guerrilla warfare. Kidnappings, executions, and massacres punctuated the brutal months and years. Families were torn apart, villages razed, crops burned. Amid this, the Red Army struggled to maintain control over the sprawling, often hostile countryside. Trotsky's forces battled on multiple fronts, not only against the whites but also against the Greens and anarchists. They deployed ruthless tactics. Hostages were taken and executed in retaliation. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were destroyed, and entire populations were subjected to martial law. This internal fragmentation made the Russian Civil War not merely a conflict of two armies, but a total war engulfing millions of people, where old grievances, new ideologies, and sheer survival instincts collided. The question, then, was not simply why the Reds and Whites fought, but why everyone fought everyone. The answer lies in the chaos of a collapsing empire, a society torn between old loyalties and new realities, where power was fluid, and the lines between friend and enemy blurred into a bloody fog. In this disordered landscape, the Russian Civil War was less a battle between two clear sides and more a crucible of many wars, each fueled by fear, ideology, vengeance, and the desperate will to survive. As the fighting raged, millions suffered. Civilians starved, refugees fled across snow-covered steppes, and the land itself seemed to burn beneath the endless gunfire. In the end, the Bolsheviks would prevail, largely because they could harness centralized power and ruthlessly suppress dissent. But the war within the war, the violence of the Greens, anarchists, and countless local militias, would leave scars that shaped the Soviet Union's future, echoing in decades of unrest and resistance. This is the story of the many wars within the Russian Civil War, a complex, tragic mosaic of humanity caught between revolution and ruin. Chapter 11. Why did foreign soldiers land in Russia? In the midst of Russia's brutal and chaotic civil war, the battlefield suddenly widened, stretching far beyond the vast Russian steppes and snowy cities. Foreign soldiers, troops from distant lands, began to arrive on Russian soil. British, French, American, Japanese, and other forces disembarked on Russian coasts and railheads, stepping into a war that was not theirs by birth, but became inseparably theirs by choice, necessity, or ambition. Why did these global powers, still reeling from the devastation of World War I, choose to intervene in Russia's internal conflict? What were their motives? And how did their presence shape the fate of the Russian Civil War? To answer these questions, we must first understand the wider context, the world at war, the collapse of the old European order, and the fear that gripped many governments as Bolshevik revolutionaries seized control of the world's largest country. In 1917, as Russia staggered under the blows of war, revolution, and famine, the allies of World War I, primarily Britain, France, and the United States, had invested heavily in the Russian war effort against Germany. They had sent arms, money, and advisors to support the Tsarist government and later the provisional government in their struggle. When the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, ending Russia's participation in the Great War, it shocked and alarmed the Allies. Suddenly, Germany freed up hundreds of thousands of troops from the Eastern Front, redirecting them to fight in the West. The prospect of a German victory loomed larger. Moreover, the Allies feared that the Bolshevik Revolution was more than a national upheaval. It was an international threat. The new Soviet regime proclaimed its desire to spread communist revolution worldwide, calling for workers in all countries to rise up. This alarmed capitalist governments and ruling classes across Europe and North America. Adding to this, vast stockpiles of Allied weapons, munitions, and supplies had been sent to Russia during the war, some still stored in Russian ports, warehouses, and rail yards. The Allies worried these could fall into German or Bolshevik hands. Against this backdrop, a coalition of foreign powers began to contemplate intervention, an attempt to influence Russia's chaotic fate, prevent German gains, and contain the spread of Bolshevism. The first landings occurred in 1918 in the northern port of Arkhangelsk and the eastern port of Vladivostok. British, French, American, and Japanese troops arrived, ostensibly to protect stockpiles of Allied supplies, assist in the rescue of the Czechoslovak Legion stranded deep inside Russia, and support anti-Bolshevik forces. The Czechoslovak Legion, a remarkable group of former Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war turned volunteer soldiers, had become an unexpected factor in the Civil War. After fighting for the Allies, they found themselves trapped behind enemy lines and sought to cross Siberia via the Trans-Siberian Railway to join the Western Front. Their control of vast stretches of railway emboldened anti-Bolshevik forces and complicated the civil conflict. For the foreign powers, backing the Whites seemed a strategic choice to restore an anti-communist regime friendly to Western interests, to maintain a barrier against German expansion, and to secure access to Russia's resources and trade routes. Yet, their presence brought mixed results, often worsening the chaos, alienating local populations, and deepening suspicions of imperialist designs. In Arkhangelsk, Allied troops found themselves in a frozen, hostile environment, fighting bitterly. Cold winters, logistical nightmares, and growing hostility from Bolshevik forces and civilians alike. In Vladivostok, Japanese forces deployed tens of thousands of troops, not only to support anti-Bolshevik forces, but to assert influence over the resource-rich Russian Far East. Their presence alarmed both local Russians and the other allies, fueling tensions among the foreign powers themselves. Meanwhile, American and British forces sought primarily to protect supply depots and assist evacuation efforts. The Americans, under General William S. Graves, adopted a more cautious approach, wary of becoming embroiled in a foreign civil war far from home. But the overarching consequence was clear. Foreign intervention deepened the complexity of the Russian Civil War, turning what might have been an internal conflict into a proxy battlefield for global powers' competing ambitions. Locally, the presence of foreign troops was deeply resented. For many Russians, regardless of their political sympathies, foreign soldiers were seen as invaders, an extension of centuries of imperialist encroachment. Propaganda on both sides exploited this resentment. The Bolsheviks painted the Whites as puppets of foreign capitalists, traitors selling out Russia's sovereignty. They portrayed the foreign troops as imperialist occupiers, symbols of a world desperate to crush the revolution. This narrative helped rally support among peasants and workers, many of whom feared a return to Tsarist oppression under white victory backed by foreign guns. But the foreign soldiers themselves often faced harsh realities, harsh weather, guerrilla warfare, and unclear objectives. Morale among these troops fluctuated as the scope of the conflict unfolded, revealing a war far messier and more fragmented than anticipated. In some cases, foreign troops engaged directly in combat operations alongside white forces. In others, they focused on guarding key supply points, training local militias, or evacuating refugees and wounded soldiers. The involvement of foreign powers also complicated diplomatic efforts. With so many actors, each with their own goals and agendas, the possibility of a negotiated peace grew ever more distant. Ultimately, foreign intervention failed to reverse the tide of the Civil War. The Bolsheviks, through ruthless organization, propaganda, and military skill, gradually consolidated power. By 1920, most foreign forces had withdrawn or been expelled. The last troops left Russian soil by 1923, marking the end of the foreign military presence. But the legacy of this intervention lingered. It left deep scars in Russian national consciousness, feeding narratives of betrayal and foreign hostility that would echo through Soviet history and beyond. The story of foreign soldiers landing in Russia during the Civil War is a story of fear, ambition, and the collision of global power with local struggle. It reveals how a domestic revolution became entangled in the wider currents of world politics, and how the hopes and fears of distant capitals played out on Russia's fractured, war-torn lands. In this chapter of history, we see not only the clash of armies but the meeting of worlds, a brutal, chaotic intersection where ideology, empire, and survival intertwined in blood and fire. Chapter 12. What was the Red Terror, and why did it spread so fast? In the darkest hours of the Russian Civil War, as violence ravaged the land and uncertainty reigned supreme, a shadow fell over the revolution, a campaign of fear, repression, and ruthless control that would come to be known as the Red Terror. But what was this Red Terror? Why did it arise so quickly? And why did it spread like wildfire across a nation already torn by war and upheaval? To understand the Red Terror, we must enter the minds of revolutionaries gripped by existential dread in a world spinning violently out of control. The year was 1918. The Bolsheviks had seized power in October of the previous year. Yet, victory did not bring peace. Rather, it plunged Russia deeper into chaos. The new regime faced enemies on all sides: the White Armies, desperate to overturn the revolution; anarchists who rejected all authority; foreign powers seeking to crush Bolshevik power; and countless ordinary citizens caught between competing forces. To in this perilous landscape, the Bolsheviks confronted a stark reality: power was fragile. The revolution was young, its hold tenuous. Around them, counter-revolutionary conspiracies whispered in shadowed corners. Assassinations, uprisings, and sabotage threatened to unravel everything. Fear, the raw, primal fear of losing everything, permeated Bolshevik ranks. This fear became a weapon wielded with brutal efficiency. It was the essence of the Red Terror. The origins of the Red Terror can be traced directly to the Bolshevik leadership's belief that their survival depended on total and uncompromising control. The revolution's enemies, real or imagined, had to be crushed swiftly, mercilessly, and publicly. In September 1918, following an assassination attempt on Vladimir Lenin himself, the Bolshevik government officially declared the Red Terror. It was no longer a secret campaign but a state policy, a terrifying message to all who dared oppose the new order. The Cheka, Bolshevik secret police led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, became the chief architects of this campaign. With near limitless powers, the Cheka operated outside the law, arresting, torturing, and executing those labeled enemies of the revolution. These enemies were a broad and often ambiguous category: former czarist officials, nobles, clergy, political opponents, suspected spies, and even peasants who resisted grain requisitioning. The reach of the Red Terror was sweeping and indiscriminate. Entire communities could be targeted on suspicion alone. Public executions, often carried out in secret or at night, became tools to instill dread. Why did the Red Terror spread so fast? Several factors converged to accelerate this brutal wave. First, the extraordinary scale of the Civil War created fertile ground for paranoia and suspicion. In a nation fractured by ideology and violence, trust was scarce. Neighbors feared neighbors. Accusations flew like wildfire. The chaos bred an atmosphere where harsh measures were not only accepted but demanded. Second, the Bolsheviks' commitment to revolutionary ideals justified their harsh methods. They framed the Red Terror as a necessary, if grim, step toward building a socialist society, one cleansed of counter-revolutionary threats. This ideology gave moral sanction to violence. Third, the Cheka's unchecked authority and their ruthless zeal led to rapid and widespread enforcement. The secret police network extended across cities, towns, and villages, rooting out dissent with terrifying speed. Fourth, propaganda played a key role. The Bolshevik press portrayed the terror as a defensive necessity, portraying the revolution as under siege by traitors and imperialist agents. This narrative mobilized support among workers and soldiers who feared reactionary forces. Finally, the harsh realities of war and famine compounded the situation. Grain requisitions, forced conscriptions, and economic collapse fueled resistance among peasants and workers. When resistance was met with repression, cycles of violence spiraled out of control. The human cost was staggering. Thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, were executed during the Red Terror. Families were torn apart. Communities were shattered. The scars left by the terror ran deep, shaping the Soviet psyche for decades. Yet, the Red Terror also succeeded in one regard. It did consolidate Bolshevik power. It eliminated or silenced many opponents, intimidated potential dissenters, and sent a chilling warning that opposition would be met with uncompromising force. But the terror was not uniform. It varied in intensity across regions, depending on local conditions and commanders. In some areas, it became a bloody purge. In others, a terrifying but controlled tool of governance. Despite the violence, many Bolsheviks saw the terror as a tragic but unavoidable necessity. They believed that the revolution's survival and the promise of a new society depended on their ability to wield fear as a shield. In the years that followed, the legacy of the Red Terror would echo in subsequent Soviet purges, showing how fear and repression could become enduring instruments of power. The Red Terror was more than a campaign of violence. It was a manifestation of revolution's darkest impulses. It was born from fear, shaped by ideology, and spread by chaos. It was a grim testament to the human cost of upheaval and a chilling reminder of how fragile freedom can become when shadowed by terror. Chapter 13. Were the Whites just as brutal as the Reds? In the brutal crucible of the Russian Civil War, violence was not confined to one side alone. The Reds, the Bolsheviks, and the Whites, their anti-Bolshevik opponents, both unleashed campaigns of terror and brutality that left deep scars on the Russian land and its people. But were the Whites just as brutal as the Reds? To answer this question, we must step beyond propaganda and into the tangled reality of a nation torn apart. The Whites were a diverse coalition. Former Tsarist officers, monarchists, liberals, nationalists, and others united by one shared goal: the defeat of the Bolsheviks. Yet, their unity was fragile, their motivations varied, and their methods, at times, ruthless. From the earliest days of the Civil War, White forces were marked by fierce determination and, often, ruthless violence. Their campaigns were brutal, sometimes indiscriminate, and often fueled by deep-seated hatred of the Bolsheviks and their supporters. Mass executions of captured Reds, suspected Bolshevik sympathizers, and civilians accused of collaboration were tragically common. White forces did not hesitate to employ terror as a weapon of intimidation and control. One of the most notorious examples was the widespread use of summary executions, often without trial or due process, against prisoners and civilians. White commanders frequently ordered such measures to stamp out Bolshevik influence swiftly and decisively. The brutality extended beyond battlefield actions. White armies sometimes engaged in looting, destruction of villages, and repression of minority groups, further alienating the population they hoped to govern. These actions deepened the cycle of violence, provoking retaliatory atrocities by Bolshevik forces and sowing hatred that would endure for generations. Yet, the White forces were far from a monolithic entity. Their commanders varied in ideology, strategy, and discipline. Some, like Admiral Kolchak in Siberia, were ruthless in their suppression of opposition, while others, such as General Denikin in the south, struggled to maintain order among undisciplined troops. The Whites' brutality was not merely a product of hatred but also desperation. Facing a determined and increasingly organized Bolshevik enemy, White commanders often resorted to extreme measures to maintain control and rally support at times. This desperation manifested in brutal reprisals against communities suspected of harboring Bolshevik sympathies, punishments that punished entire villages and deepened social divisions. In many ways, the Whites' violence reflected the fractured and chaotic nature of their coalition. With loose chains of command, lack of centralized control, and competing agendas, atrocities sometimes occurred unchecked. At the same time, White forces often portrayed themselves as defenders of law, order, and tradition. They claimed to fight for the restoration of Russia's greatness and the preservation of civilization against what they saw as Bolshevik chaos and terror. This self-image, however, was contradicted by the harsh realities on the ground, where Violence and repression became routine. The question of whether the whites were just as brutal as the Reds cannot be answered simply by comparing numbers or isolated incidents. The two sides operated in a shared context of civil war, where extreme violence became a tool of survival and political dominance. Both sides committed atrocities, mass executions, torture, forced conscriptions, and punitive raids, leaving millions of civilians caught in the crossfire. The Russian people bore the overwhelming burden of this cruelty. For many civilians, the difference between red and white was less about ideology and more about which side controlled their town at any given moment and which side would bring less suffering or fear. The war's brutality also reflected the deep social and political fractures within Russia. Peasants, workers, ethnic minorities, and soldiers found themselves forced into impossible choices, often victimized by both Reds and whites alike. Moreover, the whites' association with foreign intervention further complicated their image. Allied powers such as Britain, France, Japan, and the United States provided support to white armies, fueling suspicions among Russians that the whites were puppets of foreign imperialism. This perception undermined white legitimacy and strengthened Bolshevik propaganda, which painted the whites as enemies not just of the revolution, but of Russia itself. The Red Terror, with its systematic and ideological violence, was matched in ferocity by the sporadic but vicious brutality of white campaigns. Both sides committed acts that would haunt Russian history, acts that blurred lines between justice and revenge, power and cruelty. Yet, it is important to recognize that the Bolsheviks, once in power, institutionalized violence in a way the whites never fully achieved. The Reds built a centralized apparatus of terror, the Cheka and later the GPU, that systematically targeted enemies, real and imagined, with chilling efficiency. In contrast, white forces often lacked this centralized control, which sometimes resulted in unchecked violence by local commanders or rogue units. Still, the impact on civilians was devastating either way. Villages were razed, families torn apart, and social fabric shattered across the vast Russian expanse. Reflecting on the brutality of the Russian Civil War, we see a tragic mirror of the dangers inherent in revolutionary and counter-revolutionary struggles, where ideology, desperation, and fear converged to justify acts of unspeakable cruelty. The war's horrors were not the product of a single side's evil, but rather the chaos unleashed when a nation collapses into violence and chaos. Both Reds and whites became agents of terror, often indistinguishable in the suffering they inflicted. The Russian Civil War serves as a haunting lesson, reminding us how civil conflict can strip away humanity, turning neighbor against neighbor, and how the pursuit of power can corrupt even the noblest of causes. The smoke of battle settled. The memories of these atrocities lingered, etched in the collective memory of a people forced to endure the darkest chapters of their history. Chapter 14. Could General Wrangle have saved Russia? As the Russian Civil War dragged on, the once sprawling and fragmented white forces found themselves pushed back to the southern reaches of the vast country, a last desperate foothold against the relentless advance of the Bolsheviks. It was here, in the Crimea and southern steppes, that one man would rise as the final hope for the anti-Bolshevik cause. General Pyotr Nikolaevich Wrangle. Wrangle's name would come to symbolize the last stand of the whites, the flickering embers of resistance in a war that was drawing to a bloody close. But the question remains, could General Wrangle have saved Russia? Could he have reversed the tide of Bolshevik victory and rewritten the fate of a nation shattered by revolution and civil war? To understand this moment, we must step back into the chaotic years leading up to Wrangle's command, a time when the white movement was unraveling under the weight of military defeats, internal divisions, and dwindling support. BY 1920. The white armies that had once seemed poised to reclaim Russia were fractured and exhausted. The leadership struggles among commanders such as Admiral Kolchak in Siberia and General Denikin in the south had weakened the movement's coherence and effectiveness. Amid this turmoil, Wrangle emerged, a soldier known for his discipline, strategic mind, and a fierce commitment to restoring order. In April 1920, he was appointed commander-in-chief of the White forces in southern Russia, taking over from the faltering Denikin. Wrangle inherited a dire situation. The Whites had lost vast territories, their armies were demoralized, and the Bolsheviks, under Trotsky's iron command of the Red Army, pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. Yet, Wrangle's leadership brought a spark of renewed hope. He reorganized the shattered forces into a more effective fighting unit, emphasizing discipline, order, and morale. He also sought to improve relations with the local population, promising land reforms to peasants and greater freedoms in an effort to win popular support. Unlike his predecessors, Wrangle understood that the White cause could not survive on military might alone. It required the fragile alliance of social groups disillusioned by Bolshevik rule and the loyalty of a war-weary populace desperate for peace and stability. Under Wrangle's command, the White forces launched a series of offensives in the summer and autumn of 1920, briefly regaining some territory in the south and demonstrating a capacity for effective resistance. However, these gains were fleeting. The Bolsheviks responded swiftly with a massive counteroffensive, encircling and besieging White forces in the Crimean Peninsula. Despite valiant efforts, Wrangle's armies were increasingly isolated, cut off from potential allies, and starved of supplies. The once promising resurgence dwindled under relentless pressure. The international situation further complicated Wrangle's position. Foreign support, which the Whites had hoped would be decisive, was waning. Western powers, exhausted by World War I and wary of deeper involvement, reduced aid and political backing. Wrangle's appeals for increased assistance went largely unanswered, leaving him to confront a formidable Red Army with limited resources. As winter approached, the situation became desperate. In November 1920, faced with overwhelming odds, Wrangle ordered a strategic evacuation of his forces and tens of thousands of civilians from Crimea, an exodus that would mark the final chapter of the White resistance. This evacuation was a monumental logistical feat, saving many lives but marking the end of organized anti-Bolshevik military opposition on Russian soil. The question of whether Wrangle could have saved Russia, had circumstances been different, remains a subject of debate among historians. On one hand, Wrangle's military skill and efforts to adapt politically demonstrated a nuanced understanding of the challenges facing the Whites, a stark contrast to earlier commanders' failures to connect with the broader population. His attempts at reform and outreach suggested that, given more time and support, he might have built a more sustainable base for the anti-Bolshevik cause. On the other hand, the overwhelming strength of the Bolshevik regime, bolstered by control of Central Russia, industrial resources, and a highly motivated Red Army, posed an almost insurmountable challenge. The Bolsheviks' ability to mobilize resources and maintain political unity gave them a decisive advantage in a brutal conflict defined by attrition and ideological fervor. Additionally, the Whites' fragmented nature, ideological divisions, and lack of popular support beyond certain social classes hampered any long-term prospects for victory. That Wrangle's more moderate policies came too late to reverse decades of distrust and alienation among peasants, workers, and ethnic minorities. Furthermore, the geopolitical realities of the time, where Western powers prioritized their own interests and sought to avoid deep entanglement in Russian affairs, meant that external aid was limited and inconsistent. In the final analysis, Wrangle's leadership embodied the last flicker of hope for the White cause, a final, valiant effort to resist the sweeping tide of Bolshevik power. His evacuation from Crimea was not simply a military retreat, but a tragic acknowledgement of a lost cause, a poignant moment where the dreams of a different Russia were swept away by the unforgiving currents of history. The fate of General Wrangle and his forces symbolized the closing of a tumultuous chapter, a turning point that solidified Bolshevik control and set the stage for the Soviet era. Yet, Wrangle's story also speaks to the complexity of the Russian Civil War, a conflict shaped not only by military battles, but by ideology, social upheaval, and the hopes and fears of millions. Could he have saved Russia? Perhaps, under ideal conditions, greater unity among anti-Bolshevik forces, sustained foreign aid, and a more favorable social climate. But history is rarely shaped by what-ifs. Instead, it is written by the harsh realities on the ground, the shifting loyalties, the exhaustion of a war-weary people, and the relentless determination of the Bolshevik vision. General Wrangle's last stand in the South remains a testament to courage in the face of overwhelming odds, a final chapter of resistance before the dawn of a new Soviet Russia. In the silence that followed, as the last ships departed the Crimean shores, the echoes of a divided nation whispered of the cost of civil war, the shattered dreams, the lost futures, and the enduring scars on a people forever changed. Chapter 15. Why did Siberia turn into a graveyard? The vast expanse of Siberia, a land of towering forests, endless steppes, and bone-chilling winters, became one of the bloodiest and most tragic theaters of the Russian Civil War. Here, the hopes of the anti-Bolshevik movement collided with harsh nature, bitter betrayals, and crushing defeat. The center of this Siberian saga was Admiral Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak, once a distinguished naval officer, a man of iron will, who rose to become the self-proclaimed supreme ruler of Russia. His story, filled with ambition, desperation, and ultimate downfall, would come to define why Siberia, with all its frozen beauty, turned into a vast graveyard. To grasp the tragedy of Siberia, we must first understand the man who led the white cause there. Kolchak was no ordinary military leader. A seasoned commander in the Imperial Russian Navy, he had witnessed the collapse of the old regime and the chaos that followed in late 1918 as Bolshevik forces pressed forward. Anti-Bolshevik groups in Siberia, disparate, fractured, yet determined, looked to Kolchak as a unifying figure. With the backing of some foreign powers, particularly the British and Japanese, Kolchak was proclaimed supreme ruler in Omsk, Siberia's wartime capital. This proclamation was both a beacon of hope and a spark of controversy. Kolchak's regime promised to restore order, crush the Bolshevik uprising, and reclaim Russia from revolutionary chaos. Yet, from the outset, his leadership was shadowed by internal conflicts, strategic missteps, and a mounting sense of isolation. Siberia, with its vast distances and harsh climate, presented immense logistical challenges. Supplying troops, maintaining communication, and mobilizing forces across thousands of miles of frozen wilderness was a Herculean task, one that strained even the most capable commanders. The Kolchak's forces initially made gains, pushing westward against the Red Army. But this momentum was fragile. The harsh Siberian winter was unforgiving, and the resilience of the Red Army, fueled by ideological zeal and control of critical railway lines, slowly turned the tide. As the months dragged on, the White forces suffered devastating defeats. The brutal cold, starvation, and exhaustion gnawed at the men fighting on the front lines. Morale plummeted, and desertions increased. Yet, the most crippling blow to Kolchak's cause was not the battlefield losses, but the betrayals and political infighting that tore the White movement apart from within. Kolchak's government faced opposition from various factions: the Socialist Revolutionaries, the Cossacks, and even some conservative elements who distrusted his autocratic style. This fracturing of support weakened the unity necessary to mount a sustained resistance. Moreover, the foreign powers who had initially backed Kolchak began to withdraw their support. War fatigue, shifting geopolitical interests, and skepticism about Kolchak's leadership led to a gradual reduction in aid. The Japanese, who had a significant military presence in eastern Siberia, pursued their own agenda, further complicating the anti-Bolshevik struggle. Their limited cooperation with Kolchak's government added layers of mistrust and confusion that in this maelstrom of hardship and betrayal, Kolchak's grip on power weakened. The White armies retreated deeper into Siberia, retreating before the relentless advance of the Red Army. The final collapse came in late 1919 and early 1920. Kolchak was captured by forces loyal to the Socialist Revolutionaries, former allies turned foes, near Irkutsk. His fate was sealed that in February 1920, Kolchak was executed by Bolshevik authorities. His death was a stark symbol of the White movement's failure in Siberia and the grim consequences of divided resistance against a determined revolutionary regime. The Siberian campaign of the Russian Civil War was marked by unimaginable suffering. Thousands of soldiers and civilians perished, not only from combat, but from the brutal cold, starvation, disease, and despair. Entire villages were ravaged, towns changed hands multiple times, and families were torn apart by suspicion and violence. Siberia's transformation into a graveyard was not only a testament to the physical hardships of war, but to the political fragmentation and betrayals that doomed the anti-Bolshevik cause. Kolchak's story, tragic and complex, reveals the broader narrative of a fractured Russia, where competing visions for the country's future clashed violently, often at the cost of countless lives. The harsh Siberian winters seemed to mirror the cold indifference of fate itself, as idealism and ambition were frozen and shattered beneath the weight of reality. The Bolsheviks solidified control over Siberia. They consolidated their grip on the rest of Russia, pushing forward their vision of a new socialist order. For those who lived through the Siberian nightmare, memories of loss and betrayal lingered long after the guns fell silent. The frozen landscape, once a symbol of Russia's vastness and potential, became a chilling monument to a war that tore the nation apart. In the end, Siberia's graveyard was not merely a place of death, but a haunting reminder of the complexities and human costs of civil war, where the ambitions of men like Kolchak collided with the harsh realities of history, leaving scars that would shape Russia for generations to come. Chapter 16. Did the peasants trust anyone? The Russian Civil War was not only a battle between reds and whites. It was a devastating upheaval that tore through the lives of millions of ordinary people, especially the peasants who made up the vast majority of Russia's population. For these millions living in villages scattered across the countryside, trust became a rare and precious commodity, one that few could afford to give freely. Caught between the demands of the Bolsheviks, the violence of the White Armies, and the chaos of local warlords and bandits, the peasants found themselves trapped in a brutal struggle that seemed to offer no safe haven, no reliable protector. Who, then, did the peasants trust? The short answer is no one. The reality, however, is far more complex. Peasants, who lived simple lives tied to the land, had long been the backbone of Imperial Russia. Yet, for centuries, they had been oppressed, subject to heavy taxes, forced labor, and the whims of landowners and officials. The February Revolution of 1917, which ended centuries of Tsarist rule, had raised hopes among many peasants for a better life, particularly the promise of land reform. But when the Civil War erupted, these hopes quickly became entangled in a web of fear, suspicion, and violence. On one side, the Bolsheviks claimed to represent the working people, promising peace, land, and bread. Their slogans resonated deeply with many peasants desperate for change. Yet, Bolshevik policies often fell short, or worse, turned against the very people they aimed to win over. The policy of war communism, for example, demanded the forcible requisition of grain and foodstuffs from peasants to supply the Red Army and urban centers. This policy was deeply resented. Peasants, already struggling with poor harvests and harsh conditions, saw their livelihoods confiscated, leaving them with little to survive on. The Bolsheviks viewed such resistance as counter-revolutionary, punishing villages suspected of hoarding or rebellion with harsh reprisals. On the other side, the White Armies, despite their opposition to Bolshevism, did not inspire much trust. Either, many whites sought to restore the old social order, returning land to aristocrats and undoing peasant gains. This threat alienated peasants, who feared losing whatever land they had seized or hoped to keep. Moreover, white forces were often brutal and undisciplined, exacting heavy taxes, conscripting men, and committing atrocities in the countryside. Between these two main factions, other groups also claimed influence, including anarchists, local warlords, and peasant militias. Some peasants formed their own armed groups, fighting to defend their villages from both reds and whites, as well as from criminal gangs and foreign soldiers. These local forces, often called Greens, were motivated primarily by self-preservation. and the desire to protect their homes and families. The Greens were fiercely independent and often hostile to both Reds and Whites, seeing both as outsiders imposing unwanted authority. In many cases, peasant resistance to both sides reflected deep-rooted frustration with the endless violence and disruption. War had devastated the countryside. Fields lay fallow, villages were burned, and famine stalked the land. For peasants, the Civil War was not an ideological struggle, but a terrifying fight for survival. Trust was a casualty of this chaos. Neighbors turned on neighbors, driven by fear, suspicion, or the desire to protect limited resources. Informers and spies operated within communities, feeding information to whichever side seemed strongest or most threatening. Peasant attitudes varied widely. Some supported the Bolsheviks, hoping for genuine change. Others backed the Whites or local factions. But the overriding sentiment was one of wariness, an instinct to avoid entanglement in a conflict that offered little hope and immense risk. Even as the Bolsheviks ultimately triumphed, they never fully won the hearts of the peasants during the Civil War years. The forced grain requisitions led to widespread famine and uprisings, most notably the Tamboff Rebellion of 1920 to 1921, which became one of the largest and most serious peasant revolts against Bolshevik authority. This rebellion, led by Alexander Antonov, saw tens of thousands of peasants take up arms in protest against food seizures and harsh policies. The Bolshevik response was brutal, using the Red Army and the secret police to crush the uprising with mass arrests, executions, and scorched-earth tactics. These harsh measures deepened peasant distrust and underscored the tragic nature of their predicament. For many peasants, the Russian Civil War was a time when survival meant navigating a perilous path between violent forces that cared little for their welfare. Their resistance was not simply against one side or another, but against the very chaos that engulfed the nation. In this struggle, peasants acted not only as victims, but as agents of their own fate, sometimes siding with one faction, sometimes resisting all, shaping the course of the war in unexpected ways. The story of the peasants during the Russian Civil War reveals the human dimension behind the grand political narratives of how ordinary lives were caught in the crossfire of history. It reminds us that civil wars are not just about armies and leaders, but about communities, families, and individuals struggling to survive amid upheaval. And in the vast, frozen villages of Russia, trust remained elusive, a fragile flame flickering against the storm of war. Chapter 17. What role did women play in a man's war? When we think of war, especially one as brutal and chaotic as the Russian Civil War, our minds often picture men in battle, soldiers charging, generals commanding, armies clashing. Yet, the story of this conflict is incomplete without the women who lived through it, fought in it, and shaped its course in ways both visible and hidden. The Russian Civil War was, in many ways, a man's war, but women were far from passive bystanders. They were fighters, mothers, spies, nurses, propagandists, and survivors. Their courage, resilience, and sacrifice added a vital dimension to this turbulent chapter of history. At the outbreak of the conflict, Russia was a society deeply rooted in traditional gender roles. Women were often confined to the home, responsible for family and farm, while men took up arms. But the scale of upheaval changed everything. As millions of men were drafted into the Red Army or the White Forces, women stepped into roles previously denied to them, not out of choice, but necessity. In the factories, women became the backbone of industrial production, keeping the war machine running. They operated heavy machinery, manufactured weapons, and labored under harsh conditions, often while caring for children and elderly relatives. But beyond factories, many women took up arms themselves. The Bolsheviks, with their radical ideology, officially allowed women to enlist in the Red Army. Thousands did so, fighting alongside men on the front lines. These women were not mere auxiliaries or camp followers. They were soldiers, snipers, machine gunners, and commanders. Some became legendary for their bravery and skill. Maria Botchkareva, for example, founded the Women's Battalion of Death in 1917, an all-female combat unit intended to inspire men to fight. She herself fought in battles on the Eastern Front and was decorated for valor. Women like Botchkareva shattered stereotypes, proving that courage and patriotism transcended gender. Yet, their experience was often fraught with challenges: skepticism from male comrades, harsh discipline, and the constant threat of violence that on the white side. Women also participated in military and support roles, though often less formally recognized. Aside from combat, women served crucial roles as nurses and medics, tending to the wounded in makeshift hospitals and on the battlefield. Their work saved countless lives amid terrible conditions of scarcity, disease, and relentless violence. But the war also forced women into less visible, but equally dangerous, roles: espionage and intelligence gathering, spies and couriers. Often, women slipped behind enemy lines to deliver messages, sabotage supplies, or gather crucial information. Their ability to move with less suspicion than men made them invaluable agents of war. Many risked arrest, torture, and execution. Yet, their stories are rarely told, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and the chaos of conflict. For the millions of women who were not fighters or spies, survival itself became a daily battle. With villages and towns under siege or occupation, women bore the brunt of famine, displacement, and violence. They struggled to feed their children, maintain homes, and care for the elderly while enduring constant fear of raids, conscription, or reprisals. In some regions, women organized community support networks, sharing scarce resources and protecting each other from predatory soldiers or bandits. The psychological toll was immense. Letters and diaries from the period reveal women grappling with loss, despair, and the relentless uncertainty of war. Yet, despite the horrors, many found strength in their roles as mothers and caretakers, determined to preserve family and community. Amid destruction, women also played a key role in the political upheavals that fueled the Civil War. They participated in revolutionary movements, attending rallies, distributing leaflets, and mobilizing support for the Bolsheviks or other factions. The promise of equality, land redistribution, and social reform inspired many women to take an active political stance. The Bolshevik government, keen to harness this energy, enacted policies granting women the right to vote, divorce, and access education. Radical changes for the time. Still, the reality often fell short of ideals, as war and social conservatism limited true equality. The intersection of war and revolution created a complex landscape for women, one in which empowerment and oppression coexisted. As the Civil War dragged on, the roles of women evolved further. Many became refugees, fleeing violence in cities and countryside, moving westward or abroad to escape the chaos. Diasporas of Russian women and families formed in Europe and beyond, carrying with them memories of loss, resilience, and hope. Others remained in Soviet Russia, helping to rebuild shattered communities and contributing to the eventual consolidation of Bolshevik power. Their contributions to education, healthcare, and industry laid foundations for the Soviet state that would emerge from the ruins. It is important to recognize that the experiences of women during the Civil War were diverse, shaped by class, geography, ethnicity, and political allegiance. Peasant women faced different hardships than urban factory workers. Aristocratic women endured exile and dispossession. Ethnic minorities struggled with added layers of persecution. Yet, across all these experiences, a common thread is clear. Women were not mere spectators to history. They were its makers. Their stories illuminate the human cost of war and revolution, revealing facets of courage, endurance, and agency often overlooked in traditional narratives. The Russian Civil War was a crucible that tested the limits of human endurance. In its fires, women forged new identities and roles, challenging the constraints of their society and the horrors of war. Their legacy is woven into the fabric of Russian history, a testament to the strength of those who fight not only with weapons, but with love, sacrifice, and unwavering will to survive. In remembering the Russian Civil War, we must honor the women whose voices, though sometimes silent, echo powerfully through time. fighters on the battlefield, caretakers in the home, spies in the shadows, and survivors against all odds. Chapter 18. What happens to a generation raised in war? War, in its most devastating form, does not only claim the lives of those who march to the battlefield. It scars those who are too young to fight, yet old enough to remember. It steals childhoods and reshapes futures. The Russian Civil War was no exception. Amid the clamor of guns and the upheaval of empires, a generation of children was born, raised, and scarred by the relentless violence and chaos. These were the forgotten children of revolution, orphans, refugees, young soldiers, and survivors who lived through a world unrecognizable to any previous generation, from 1917 to 1923. As the Tsarist regime collapsed and the Bolsheviks seized power, millions of children found themselves caught in the storm, torn from families, plunged into poverty, and forced to grow up fast in cities like Petrograd and Moscow, once bustling. With life and hope, war brought hunger, disease, and fear. Families struggled to feed their children amid food shortages caused by blockades, requisitions, and disrupted agriculture. Children's bodies weakened by starvation and sickness became a common sight. Tuberculosis, typhus, and influenza swept through orphanages and slums. The war was not only fought on battlefields, it was fought in the streets, homes, and hospitals where the young and vulnerable suffered in silence. Millions of children lost their parents to conscription, execution, famine, or flight. Orphans swelled the ranks of the homeless, roaming the ruins of towns and cities. Some became street urchins, scavenging for food and shelter, forming gangs to survive the lawlessness of wartime Russia. Others were taken into overcrowded and underfunded orphanages run by the fledgling Soviet government or charitable organizations. But life in these institutions was often harsh. Resources were scarce, discipline was strict, and disease was rampant. Many children slipped through the cracks, vanishing into the shadows of history in the countryside. The situation was no less grim. Peasant families, already burdened by poverty and war requisitions, struggled to protect their young from the violence of marauding armies and bandits. Some villages were burned, and entire families wiped out in brutal reprisals. Children who survived were left to tend to the wounded, care for siblings, or run family farms with little guidance or support. Amid this chaos, the line between childhood and adulthood blurred. Young boys and girls, some no older than 10, found themselves recruited or conscripted into armies, red, white, or partisan groups. The Bolsheviks, recognizing the power of youth, formed organizations like the Young Pioneers and the Komsomol, aiming to mold children into future citizens of the Soviet state. Yet, during the Civil War, many children served as messengers, scouts, or even fighters, their innocence sacrificed on the altar of conflict. The psychological toll on these young souls was profound. Witnessing death, destruction, and betrayal shattered their worldviews and robbed them of normalcy. Many carried scars invisible to the eye, trauma that would shape their lives long after the guns fell silent. Survivors of this lost generation spoke little of their experiences, burdened by memories too painful to share. Yet, their stories are essential to understanding the human cost of revolution. Some children managed to find hope amid despair. Education became a beacon of possibility. The new Soviet regime, despite its chaos and repression, invested in schooling. Programs aimed at eradicating illiteracy and shaping loyal citizens. For many war orphans, schools offered a rare refuge, a place of learning, community, and safety. Teachers, often volunteers driven by revolutionary zeal, worked tirelessly to provide knowledge and stability. Yet, the quality of education varied widely, and many children missed out due to displacement or poverty. In the years following the Civil War, the government sought to address the plight of war orphans and vulnerable youth. Special institutions were created to care for them, often blending education with ideological training. But the scars of war lingered. Many children struggled to reintegrate into society, bearing the weight of loss and hardship. Some turned to crime or rebellion, while others became model citizens, shaped by the ideals of the new state. The legacy of this generation would echo through Soviet history, in literature, art, and policy. Writers like Isaac Babel and Alexander Solzhenitsyn would later depict the brutality and resilience of those years, giving voice to the silent witnesses of war. The children of the Russian Civil War were shaped by forces beyond their control, swept up in tides of history they neither chose nor understood. Their experiences reveal the profound human consequences of political upheaval, how revolution and war extend their reach far beyond soldiers and leaders. They remind us that the cost of conflict is paid in full by the most vulnerable, the children who inherit the world left broken in its wake. Remembering these forgotten children, we honor not only their suffering but also their survival. Through their eyes, we glimpse the enduring strength of the human spirit, the will to endure, to hope, and to rebuild even after the darkest storms. The Russian Civil War may have reshaped nations, but it irrevocably transformed a generation whose stories demand to be heard, remembered, and understood. Chapter 19. How do you fight back without guns? War is often defined by battles, by guns firing, armies clashing, and territory seized. But in the shadowed corners of the Russian Civil War, a quieter, yet no less courageous, struggle unfolded. How do you resist when you lack weapons? When the roar of cannons drowns out voices? When your enemy controls the streets, the government, and the guns? This was the challenge faced by countless individuals and communities during the tumultuous years of 1917 to 1923. Those who could not, or would not, take up arms, but who still found ways to fight back in the chaos of revolution and civil war. Underground resistance was born, an intricate network of secret defiance, silent courage, and unyielding hope. Across cities and countryside, people resisted the Bolshevik regime, the whites, foreign interventionists, and even anarchists, using methods that were invisible to the grand narratives of battlefields but vital to the very survival of dissent. It began with the refusal to comply in factories. Peasants and workers slowed production, sabotaged machinery, or staged subtle acts of insubordination. These acts, small on the surface, created ripples of disruption that undermined the war effort and challenged authority. In homes and neighborhoods, clandestine meetings brought together families, intellectuals, and dissidents to share news, ideas, and plans. Whispers of hope passed from one person to another, carried in coded language and hidden in plain sight. The risks were immense. Secret police networks, informants, and harsh reprisals meant that discovery often led to imprisonment, torture, or death. Yet, even under the watchful eyes of the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, people found ways to resist. Messages were hidden in letters, songs, and literature. Books and newspapers critical of the regime circulated covertly, spreading ideas that could not be silenced. One remarkable form of resistance was the role of underground newspapers and pamphlets. These fragile, hand-copied documents offered a lifeline for those longing for truth, for an alternative to propaganda, for voices beyond the official line. They told stories of hardship, courage, and defiance, of those who refused to surrender their minds and spirits. In rural areas, peasants resisted collectivization and forced requisitioning not only through rebellion but also through subtle forms of evasion. They hid grain, slowed delivery, and moved livestock in secret. These acts were dangerous. The government's response was brutal, but they spoke of a deep-rooted will to maintain autonomy and dignity. Women, too, played a vital role in underground resistance, often underestimated by the regime. Women organized support networks for families of prisoners, delivered messages, and cared for the wounded. They kept communities alive. Even as men were conscripted or killed, spies and informants operated on all sides. The fluid loyalties and chaotic conditions of the Civil War created opportunities for covert operations that shaped battles and political outcomes. One of the most notable aspects of this hidden war was the role of the intelligentsia, writers, artists, teachers, and thinkers who risked everything to keep free thought alive. Many used metaphor, symbolism, and allegory to critique the regime and inspire resistance. Even when direct criticism was impossible, their works, smuggled out or published secretly, became beacons of resilience. Children, too, learned the art of resistance through songs, stories, and secret codes passed down from parents and neighbors. The desire for freedom, for a better future, permeated every corner of society, even in the darkest times. Yet, underground resistance was not without its contradictions. In some cases, factions fought each other as much as their common enemies. Distrust, ideological divides, and desperation sometimes fractured these networks, weakening their impact. The complexity of loyalty and identity in the Civil War meant that resistance took many forms, from violent insurgency to quiet defiance. Despite the dangers, the underground struggle demonstrated that power is never absolute. Even when guns are silenced, the human spirit finds a way to fight back. These acts of courage were often anonymous, unsung, and undocumented. But they sustained hope, the fragile thread that held communities together. They remind us that resistance is not only in grand battles or revolutions, but in everyday acts of bravery, in words spoken softly, hands extended in help, and hearts committed to justice. The underground resistance of the Russian Civil War reveals a deeper truth about conflict, that war is not only fought with weapons, but with ideas, faith, and perseverance. As the guns finally fell silent and the Soviet state emerged from the chaos, these hidden battles shaped the society to come, forging a legacy of resilience amid repression. In the end, fighting back without guns required a courage of a different kind, one that risks everything without making noise, yet changes the course of history all the same. Chapter 20. Was God defeated in revolutionary Russia? The Russian Civil War tore through the very fabric of society, shaking empires, tearing families apart, and challenging everything people had believed for centuries. Amid the roar of guns and the clash of armies, another war was unfolding, quieter, but no less fierce. A war against faith itself. Was God defeated in revolutionary Russia? This question echoes through the corridors of history, because for millions, belief was more than just a personal refuge. It was the core of identity, culture, and hope. The Russian Orthodox Church, with its golden domes and ancient rituals, had stood as a pillar of Russian life for centuries. It was intertwined with the monarchy, the traditions of the people, and the rhythms of daily existence. But the Bolsheviks, inspired by Marxist ideology, saw religion as an enemy, a tool of oppression, a poison that dulled the minds of the masses. Their vision was clear: to build a secular, atheist society, free from what they called the chains of superstition. And so, the war against God began in earnest. Churches were shuttered, bells silenced, and crosses torn down. Monasteries, once places of prayer and learning, were turned into prisons or warehouses. Priests and bishops were arrested, tortured, or executed, their voices silenced beneath the hammer of the new regime. But this assault on faith was more than physical destruction. It was a battle for the soul of a nation. Propaganda filled the airwaves and newspapers, denouncing religion as backward and dangerous. Religious education was banned. Children were taught to question, to reject the stories of saints and miracles. The sacred was reduced to superstition, an enemy of progress and science. Yet, despite the fierce repression, faith refused to die in the remote villages of Russia, where the presence of the Soviet state was weaker. Churches remained open, and people gathered in secret to pray. Belief became an act of rebellion, a quiet, stubborn resistance to the new order. Families passed down icons and prayers in hushed tones, keeping the flame of tradition alive. The war against God fractured communities, pitting those who embraced the revolution against those who clung to faith. In cities, many young people eagerly embraced atheism, convinced by promises of a new world. But for countless others, especially the older generation, religion was a lifeline amid chaos and loss. The Bolsheviks sought not just to eliminate religion, but to replace it with a new faith in the state, in the collective, in Marxist ideology, the cult of personality around Lenin and later. Stalin took on quasi-religious features, rituals, slogans, and ceremonies that sought to fill the void left by the church. Yet, this was a hollow faith for many, forced, political, and devoid of the spiritual comfort they once knew. The question remains, was God truly defeated? In the public sphere, the answer seemed clear. The church was shattered, the clergy silenced, and atheism enforced as law. But beneath the surface, belief endured, sometimes in secret, sometimes transformed, but never completely extinguished. Survivors spoke of visions and prayers that sustained them through hunger, war, and imprisonment. The sacred found new forms in poetry, art, and the whispered stories of those who refused to let go. For many, faith became a quiet defiance, a way to assert their humanity when everything else was stripped away. The war against churches and belief left scars that lasted long after the guns fell silent. It reshaped Russian society, its culture, its values, and its relationship to the divine. Yet, it also revealed the resilience of faith and the profound human need for meaning beyond politics and power. In revolutionary Russia, God may have been driven underground, but he was never truly defeated. Chapter 21. When did the whites truly begin to lose? The Russian Civil War was not just a clash of armies. It was a battle for the very future of Russia. On one side stood the Reds, the Bolsheviks, fueled by revolutionary zeal and a vision of a new society. On the other, the whites, a fractured coalition of monarchists, liberals, conservatives, and anyone opposed to Bolshevik rule. The whites held hope, a hope to restore order, tradition, and perhaps even the old regime. But when exactly did their hope begin to crumble? When did the whites truly begin to lose? At first, the anti-Bolshevik forces seemed formidable. They controlled vast stretches of territory, the south, the east, parts of Siberia, and had support from foreign powers, supplies, and experienced officers. Yet, from the outset, the whites were burdened by their own divisions. They were not a unified force, but a patchwork of competing interests and ideologies, often at odds with each other. This lack of cohesion would prove fatal. The white armies lacked a clear, compelling vision for Russia's future. They were often seen as the defenders of the old order, the aristocracy, the landed gentry, which alienated peasants and workers who had suffered under Tsarist rule. Moreover, the whites struggled with their image. Bolshevik propaganda painted them as reactionaries, foreign puppets, and enemies of progress. This narrative found fertile ground among a war-weary and impoverished population. Despite initial military successes, the whites were plagued by poor coordination and strategic mistakes. In the south, General Denikin's forces advanced toward Moscow, only to be halted by fierce Bolshevik resistance and internal dissent. In Siberia, Admiral Kolchak proclaimed himself supreme ruler but failed to rally sufficient support. His harsh policies and inability to connect with the local population sowed discontent. Foreign intervention, initially a boost for the whites, became a double-edged sword. While British, French, American, and Japanese troops provided equipment and limited direct support, their presence fueled nationalist resentment. Many Russians viewed the whites as collaborators with foreign invaders, a stain that undermined their legitimacy. By late 1919, the tide began to turn decisively. The Red Army, reorganized and disciplined under Trotsky's leadership, launched a series of counteroffensives that steadily pushed white forces back. The Reds capitalized on their ability to mobilize popular support through promises of land reform and workers' rights. They controlled major cities, transport networks, and industrial centers, vital arteries for war efforts. As the whites retreated, morale plummeted, desertions increased, and internal quarrels grew bitter. Leaders blamed each other for failures, while rank-and-file soldiers faced starvation, exhaustion, and despair. The death toll on both sides was staggering, and the civilian population caught in the crossfire suffered terribly. Yet, amidst the chaos, the Bolsheviks consolidated power, building institutions, enforcing discipline, and imposing a brutal order. The whites, by contrast, appeared fragmented and unable to inspire hope. By early 1920, the final blows came as Denikin's forces were pushed into Crimea, where General Wrangle made a last stand. Despite his efforts to reorganize and reform, Wrangle's army was isolated. Surrounded and outnumbered in Siberia, Kolchak was captured and executed, his death signaling the collapse of white resistance in the east. The retreat was more than military defeat. It marked the unraveling of the counter-revolution itself. The whites had failed not just on the battlefield, but in winning the hearts and minds of the Russian people. They were seen as remnants of a lost era, unable or unwilling to address the demands for change that had ignited the revolution. Their association with foreign powers further discredited them in the eyes of many Russians. In contrast, the Bolsheviks projected an image of inevitability, the builders of a new order that, despite its brutality, offered hope of stability and reform. The moment when the whites truly began to lose was not a single day or battle, but a gradual process of erosion. Fueled by internal divisions, strategic errors, and the shifting tides of popular support, it was a defeat born from within, as much as from outside forces. As the last pockets of white resistance fell, the Bolsheviks cemented their control, and the course of Russian history was irrevocably changed. The counter-revolution had unraveled, leaving a country scarred by war, but poised to enter a new, uncertain era in the end. The whites lost not just the fight, but the chance to define Russia's future. Their failure stands as a stark reminder of how unity, vision, and connection to the people can determine the fate of a revolution. Chapter 22. What happened to the ones who fled? As the guns fell silent across the vast Russian landscape, a different kind of battle began, not one fought with bullets or artillery, but with heartbreak, displacement, and exile. The Russian Civil War had torn apart families, communities, and the very fabric of society. For millions, the end of active fighting did not mean peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a harrowing journey, a desperate flight from a homeland plunged into chaos and ruled by an unforgiving new regime. Who were these ones who fled? What became of them as they left behind everything familiar, crossing borders into uncertain futures? The story of those who fled Russia after the Civil War is a story of loss, resilience, and the enduring pain of exile in the final years of the conflict. As Bolshevik forces tightened their grip, thousands of soldiers, officers, aristocrats, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens chose flight over surrender. The anti-Bolshevik white armies, their leadership, and many of their supporters found themselves cornered, their hopes crushed, across the southern steppes and into the ports of the Black Sea. Ships waited to carry away the last remnants of the defeated point. One of the most poignant chapters in this exodus was the evacuation of Crimea in late 1920. Under the command of General Wrangle, the Red Army advanced relentlessly. Wrangle ordered a massive evacuation, a chaotic, desperate effort to save not just troops, but civilians as well. The harbors of Sevastopol and other Crimean ports became scenes of frantic boarding, families clutching their few possessions, eyes filled with fear and sorrow. Ships overloaded with thousands set sail into the unknown, leaving behind homes, graves, and memories. Those who escaped often found themselves scattered across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, displaced persons and lands that were sometimes as foreign as the chaos they fled. But the journey was only the beginning of their exile. Life in foreign lands was harsh, marked by poverty, cultural dislocation, and a profound sense of loss. For many, the Russian diaspora became a fractured community, bound by shared history, yet divided by politics, language, and survival struggles. The so-called white émigrés, former officers, nobility, and intellectuals, sought to preserve their culture and political ideals, founding newspapers, schools, and organizations in cities like Paris, Berlin, and Istanbul. But they lived in limbo, unable to return home, yet often unwelcome in their new countries. For ordinary refugees, the hardships were even greater. Stripped of property, status, and security, many faced hunger, discrimination, and exploitation. The trauma of sudden exile left deep psychological scars, a pervasive longing for a homeland that had become inaccessible. A nation transformed beyond recognition. The Soviets, meanwhile, viewed these émigrés with suspicion and hostility. The new regime branded them as enemies of the people, traitors who had abandoned the revolution. This ideological divide ensured that reconciliation would be impossible for decades. In some cases, Soviet agents pursued émigrés abroad, spreading fear and limiting their ability to organize freely. Yet, even in exile, the Russian spirit endured. Artists, writers, and thinkers among the émigrés produced some of the 20th century's most poignant works, reflections on loss, identity, and the meaning of home. Their contributions enriched the cultural landscapes of their adopted countries, even as they mourned the Russia they had lost. The children born in exile, the white émigré generation, grew up straddling two worlds. For them, Russia was a story told by parents, a place of legend and pain, rather than lived experience. This generational rupture deepened the tragedy of exile, as ties to homeland faded while memories persisted. Not all who fled settled in the West. Some sought refuge in East Asia, particularly in Harbin and Shanghai, where vibrant Russian communities formed. Here, too, émigrés faced uncertainty as political tides shifted and the threat of Japanese and later Chinese political upheavals loomed. Eventually, many had to flee yet again, continuing a pattern of displacement that stretched far beyond the Civil War itself. For those who stayed behind, the consequences were grim. Families of émigrés were often labeled enemies of the people, subjected to arrest, exile to labor camps. Or worse, the Bolsheviks' terror did not end with the guns. It extended into purges that targeted anyone associated with the old regime or suspected of disloyalty. In the decades that followed, the memory of the Civil War and its exiles shaped Russian history, politics, and identity. The émigré communities kept alive alternative visions of Russia, of a nation free from Bolshevik rule, steeped in the traditions and values they cherished. But these visions were distant dreams, increasingly overshadowed by the Soviet state's reality. The story of the ones who fled, their heartbreak and resilience, remains a crucial part of understanding the full human cost of the Russian Civil War. It is a tale of exile and survival, of communities uprooted but unbroken, and of the enduring pain that comes when a people are forced to leave their homeland behind. Their journeys remind us that war's devastation extends far beyond the battlefield, echoing through generations, across continents, and deep into the soul of a nation. Chapter 23. Why did the revolution turn on its own? In the swirling chaos of revolution and civil war, where loyalties were fluid and enemies often indistinguishable from allies, one question haunts the history of the Russian Civil War. Why did the revolution turn on its own? Why did those who had fought side by side against the old regime suddenly find themselves pitted against each other, locked in bitter conflict? At the heart of this tragic paradox lies the Kronstadt rebellion, a dramatic and violent rupture that exposed deep fractures within the revolutionary movement itself. Kronstadt, a naval fortress and port city on the island near Petrograd, was more than just a strategic location. It was a symbol, a bastion of revolutionary sailors. Once hailed as heroes of the 1917 revolutions, fiercely independent and known for their radical zeal, the sailors of Kronstadt had played a pivotal role in the February and October revolutions, standing against Tsarist forces and then supporting the Bolshevik uprising. Their ships and guns helped secure Bolshevik power in Petrograd, making them, for a time, trusted allies of Lenin and Trotsky. But by 1921, the mood in Kronstadt had shifted profoundly. The promises of the revolution, freedom, equality, and power to the workers and peasants, seemed betrayed. The Civil War had dragged on, and with it, harsh economic conditions worsened. The once hopeful vision of a workers' paradise was replaced by famine, repression, and growing authoritarianism under Bolshevik rule. The sailors, soldiers, and civilians of Kronstadt were among the first to speak out, to demand a return to true Soviet democracy, freedom of speech, an end to Bolshevik monopolization of power, and the right to free elections. Their demands echoed those of the broader population. Suffering under war communism, a policy that, while designed to sustain the Red Army, had brought severe shortages, food requisitions, and widespread despair. What followed was a profound betrayal, a violent suppression of the very revolutionaries, who had once been hailed as its champions. The Kronstadt rebellion was not a minor disturbance. It was a full-scale uprising. The rebels raised the red and black flags, symbolizing unity between anarchists and socialists, demanding a new, more democratic order, one that respected workers' rights and freedoms. They called for Soviets, free from Bolshevik control, freedom of the press, and the release of political prisoners. Yet, the Bolshevik leadership, fearful of losing power and desperate to maintain control amid ongoing civil war threats, responded with ruthless force. Trotsky, now Commissar of War and architect of the Red Army, personally directed the brutal military assault on Kronstadt. The Red Army, equipped with artillery and overwhelming numbers, stormed the fortress in March 1921, despite fierce resistance and the sailors' legendary tenacity. The rebellion was crushed in a matter of weeks. The aftermath was grim. Thousands were killed in battle or executed afterward. Many more were imprisoned or sent to forced labor camps, a grim foreshadowing of the purges that would scar Soviet history. This violent suppression of Kronstadt shocked the world and disillusioned many supporters of the Bolshevik cause. How could a revolution that promised liberation justify turning its guns on its own heroes? The answer lies in the deep tensions within the Bolshevik vision itself, a vision that, in practice, demanded absolute control, often at the expense of the very freedoms it claimed to uphold. For Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership, the civil war was a battle for survival. Any dissent was seen not as legitimate opposition, but as counter-revolutionary threat, a danger to the fragile grip on power Kronstadt was. In their eyes, not just a rebellion, but a betrayal, a threat that, if left unchecked, could unravel everything they had fought for. But for the sailors and rebels, it was a fight to reclaim the revolution's promise, to restore democracy, freedom, and justice. The brutal suppression marked a turning point, signaling the shift from revolutionary idealism to authoritarian rule. That it revealed the limits of the Bolshevik claim to represent the proletariat, exposing contradictions between the rhetoric of liberation and the reality of political repression. Kronstadt was a microcosm of the wider struggles tearing apart Russian society, a society exhausted by war, hunger, and fear. The rebellion was not just a military conflict. It was a profound moral crisis, a heartbreak that reverberated through generations. The voices of the Kronstadt rebels echoed the pain of millions, those who believed in the revolution, only to see it betray them. Their legacy is a stark reminder of how revolutions can devour their own children, how the pursuit of power can lead to betrayal, and how ideals can be sacrificed on the altar of survival. In the end, the Kronstadt rebellion stands as a symbol of courage, resistance, and tragic loss. A testament to the human cost of revolution turned inward. It forces us to ask difficult questions about the nature of power, the price of loyalty, and the meaning of freedom in a time of upheaval. Why did the revolution turn on its own? Because, in the crucible of civil war, fear and necessity often overshadow hope and justice. Because the struggle for a new world is never without its shadows. Because, sometimes, the hardest battles are fought not against enemies outside, but within. Chapter 24. Did Lenin really embrace capitalism to save communism? In the ashes of civil war, amid hunger, ruin, and despair, a startling transformation unfolded, a shift so profound, so paradoxical, that it continues to perplex historians and scholars to this day. This was the new economic policy, or NEP. Lenin's controversial and surprising retreat from the rigid policies of war communism. For a leader who preached the abolition of capitalism, the NEP seemed, on the surface, like a betrayal, a reluctant embrace of the very system the Bolsheviks had sworn to destroy. To understand why Lenin turned to this strange compromise, we must first grasp the devastation that engulfed Russia by 1921. Years of war, First the World War, then the brutal Civil War, had ravaged the land. Factories lay silent. Farms were empty or deserted. Cities were ghostly shadows of their former selves. Stricken by famine, inflation, and despair, war communism, the policy of strict government control over production and distribution, had been enforced with an iron fist. Grain was requisitioned from peasants, often by force. Private trade was banned. Factories operated under state control. The goal was clear: to feed the Red Army and maintain revolutionary discipline during the war. But in peace, this system began to collapse under its own weight. Peasants, robbed of their harvest, had little incentive to produce. Food production plummeted. Starvation spread across the countryside. Cities faced mass hunger. The economy was on the brink of collapse. Faced with this crisis, Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership made a pragmatic decision, one that shocked many of their comrades and supporters. In 1921, Lenin announced the new economic policy, a tactical retreat from pure communism. The NEP reintroduced limited private enterprise. Peasants were allowed to sell their surplus grain on the open market. Small businesses and shops reopened under private ownership. Markets buzzed with traders. Once again, money returned. This was a deliberate compromise, an acknowledgement that the revolution could not survive without a breathing space for capitalism to function. The NEP was, in Lenin's own words, one step backward, two steps forward. But the contradiction was glaring. How could a communist revolution tolerate capitalism, even temporarily? The answer lay in Lenin's strategic vision. The Bolsheviks were still surrounded by enemies. Inside and outside Russia, the revolution was fragile. The economy was broken. The people were starving. To rebuild the country, the regime needed to restore agricultural and industrial production. And to do that, they had to offer peasants and small entrepreneurs a taste of freedom and profit. The NEP was a pragmatic, if uneasy, truce between ideology and reality. Yet, it was never intended as a permanent solution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks viewed the NEP as a necessary evil, a transitional phase to stabilize the economy before returning to full socialism. The policy sparked fierce debate within the party. Hardliners condemned it as a betrayal, a dangerous concession to capitalist forces. They warned it would nurture a new bourgeoisie, the so-called NEP men, who would undermine the revolution's goals. But others argued it was essential for survival, to buy time and rebuild from the ruins. For the common people, the NEP brought mixed emotions. Peasants welcomed the chance to sell their crops and improve their lives. Shopkeepers and traders flourished. Cities regained some vitality, but the scars of war and repression remained. Inequality returned. Class tensions simmered beneath the surface. The NEP was neither a golden age nor a complete rollback. It was a complex, contradictory experiment, a balancing act between the ideals of communism and the harsh demands of survival. In many ways, the NEP reshaped the Soviet Union's future. It allowed the Bolsheviks to consolidate power, rebuild the economy, and prepare for the next phase of socialist transformation. But it also exposed the fragility of revolutionary ideals when confronted by real-world challenges. Lenin's gamble was a test of political flexibility and vision, a reminder that revolutions, like all human endeavors, must adapt to survive. In embracing capitalism to save communism, Lenin revealed the paradox at the heart of the Russian Revolution, that ideology and pragmatism often collide, and that history rarely follows a straight path. The new economic policy remains a profound chapter in revolutionary history, a story of compromise, survival, and the uneasy dance between principle and power. Chapter 25. How was the Soviet Union actually born? In the bitter, frozen winter of 1922, a new nation emerged, a nation forged not from peaceful consensus, but from the ashes of war, rebellion, and deep, unforgiving conflict. The Soviet Union was born, but to understand its birth, we must step back, beyond the grand speeches and official declarations, to the brutal, chaotic years that shattered an empire and remade the world. Russia, by the early 1920s, was a land unrecognizable. From its imperial past, The echoes of the First World War had barely faded. When the guns of the Russian Civil War tore through its countryside and cities, the old order, the Romanovs, the aristocrats, the Tsarist bureaucracy, had collapsed, swept away in the storms of revolution. Yet what replaced it was not yet a clear, stable future. Instead, there was devastation. Families broken, fields burned, entire towns emptied by famine and fear. Millions had died. Millions more were displaced, wandering the vastness of the country in search of safety or sustenance. Amid this chaos, a vision struggled to take root. The vision of a new socialist state, where the proletariat and peasants would rule and the chains of oppression would be broken forever. But visions alone do not build nations. The birth of the Soviet Union was a story of blood and terror, of ruthless political struggle and ideological zeal. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and his inner circle, were determined to unite this fractured land, not through compromise, but through power. After years of civil war, they held the reins. The defeat of the Whites, the suppression of the Greens, and the crushing of internal dissent left the Bolsheviks as the uncontested rulers. Yet, the country they controlled was deeply fractured, economically ruined, socially fragmented, and politically unstable. To survive, the new regime had to consolidate its hold, to create a structure strong enough to govern such vast, diverse territories and to withstand the pressures both from within and beyond its borders. In December 1922, the formal union was declared. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. The IT united four founding republics: the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. This was no mere administrative reorganization. It was an ideological statement, an attempt to stitch together the torn fabric of an empire, while imposing a new political order. At its core was the Communist Party, a single, all-powerful entity that would dictate the course of the nation. Underneath the lofty language of brotherhood and equality, there lay the mechanisms of control. The Cheka, which had begun as a wartime secret police, evolved into the OGPU, the feared agency of political surveillance and repression. Its reach extended into every corner of society. Fear became a tool, a means to silence opposition and enforce conformity. The Red Army remained vigilant, a symbol of power and discipline, ready to crush any resistance. But the birth of the Soviet Union was not merely about power. It was about ideology, the belief that history was on the side of the workers and peasants, that capitalism was doomed, and that socialism would usher in a new age of justice and progress. Marxism-Leninism became the state's guiding doctrine. Education, culture, and even daily life were reshaped to fit this vision. Schools taught the new history, the triumph of the proletariat. Art and literature served the cause, celebrating the builders of communism and the heroes of revolution. But this was a society built on contradictions. The promise of liberation coexisted with repression. The rhetoric of equality masked vast inequalities within the party elite. The new nomenclatura. Millions of peasants, who had hoped for land and freedom, found themselves subject to harsh requisitions and controls. Workers, too, faced strict discipline in factories and collective farms. The old Russia, with all its faults, was gone, replaced by a new state, where the individual was subordinate to the collective and loyalty was enforced with iron fists. Yet, despite these challenges, the Soviet Union survived and grew. It absorbed new republics, expanded its influence, and embarked on an ambitious project to transform society and economy. Electrification, industrialization, and education were heralded as the engines of progress. But beneath this veneer of modernization lay the scars of violence and fear. The Civil War's shadow lingered. Thousands who had opposed the Bolsheviks remained imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The state maintained its monopoly on violence, justifying it as necessary to protect the revolution. The Soviet Union's birth was not a peaceful dawn, but a hard-fought, often brutal emergence. Its foundations were laid in blood and fear, but also in an unyielding belief that a new world was possible. This belief propelled the leaders and the people forward, even as they confronted the immense challenges of rebuilding a shattered land. The question remains, what price was paid for this new union? For many, the Soviet Union represented hope, a break from the chaos and misery of war. For others, it was the beginning of a long night of repression and hardship. The birth of the Soviet Union was the culmination of revolution, war, and ideological struggle, a moment that reshaped the fate of a continent and reverberated across the 20th century. To truly understand it, we must remember not only the grand vision, but the human cost, the millions of lives forever changed by the making of this new world order. This was the Soviet Union's beginning, a land united by ideology, secured by fear, and forged in the relentless fires of history. Chapter 26. Was it truly a victory, or just a different kind of tyranny? The guns finally fell silent. The sweeping chaos of the Russian Civil War, the battles, betrayals, and bloodshed had come to an end. The Bolsheviks stood victorious, but what truly had been won? Was this victory a triumph of justice, freedom, and the promise of a new society? Or, beneath the triumphant banners and speeches, was it simply the rise of a different kind of tyranny? The aftermath of the war was not the dawn of a new era of peace and prosperity, as many had hoped. Instead, it was a dark and complex reality, a world scarred by destruction, fear, and loss. From 1917 to the early 1920s, Russia had been torn apart by the violence of revolution and civil conflict. Millions of lives were lost, soldiers, civilians, families caught in the merciless crossfire. Cities were devastated, farms lay fallow, factories closed. The infrastructure of an empire, vast and intricate, lay in ruins. The social fabric was shredded. Families were divided by ideology, by geography, by survival. Those who survived the fighting faced new challenges: famine, disease, displacement. In this fragile, broken land, the Bolsheviks imposed their vision of order. The victory, they declared, was a hard, grim conquest. Lenin and his comrades promised a society rebuilt on equality, a classless world where workers and peasants would hold power. But the price of that promise was steep. To consolidate control, the Bolsheviks created a political system of unparalleled centralization. The Communist Party became the undisputed ruler, not through democratic consent, but through suppression and coercion. The Red Terror, begun during the war, expanded. Opposition voices were silenced by imprisonment, exile, or execution. Freedom of speech, assembly, and press became illusions. The Chika, the feared secret. Police monitored, arrested, and eliminated those deemed enemies of the revolution. The promise of liberation turned into a regime of control. The new economic policy, a pragmatic retreat from war communism, briefly allowed some market activity. Yet, this did little to ease the suffering of many. Peasants and workers remained under strict state supervision. Dissent was crushed wherever it appeared. The war's end did not bring peace to the hearts and minds of Russia's people. Many carried the trauma of loss and displacement. The rural countryside, where millions of peasants lived, was devastated by famine and requisition. The urban centers were burdened by poverty and unrest. Ethnic minorities, caught between competing nationalist and Soviet loyalties, found themselves repressed or forcibly assimilated. The revolution's ideals of brotherhood and equality were betrayed by the reality of violence and control. Moreover, the Soviet state's boundaries were drawn with force. Nations that once sought independence were absorbed into the Union, often against their will. The Bolsheviks wielded ideology as a weapon to unify, but also to dominate. In this new world, the individual's rights were subordinate to the needs of the collective, as defined by the party. The Civil War's bitter lessons shaped the Soviet Union's future. It was a state born not of peaceful consensus, but of struggle and suppression. The machinery of power was built on fear, surveillance, and unyielding authority. Some historians argue that this was an inevitable consequence of revolution. that the destruction of old regimes often leads not to freedom, but to new forms of oppression. Others see it as a tragic choice, a betrayal of the very ideals the revolution claimed to uphold. The people who fought, died, and suffered during those years had hoped for a better life. But for many, the peace that followed was a continuation of hardship, just under a different banner. The Civil War's end was not a simple victory or defeat, that it was a transformation, one that shaped the course of Russian and world history for decades to come. As the Soviet Union rose from the ashes of empire and war, the question remained: was this new order a liberation or a new form of tyranny? The echoes of that question resonate still, a reminder that history's victories are never without cost, and that the true measure of any revolution lies not only in the power it seizes, but in the freedom it grants.